Juqian was very sleepy, but he woke up because something smelled very bad. Zhu did not immediately realize what it could be. He thought it was his dog Yerha. Perhaps it was her who came and wanted to shit on the bed again. This dog does this a lot. Zhu hates her at these moments. This is some kind of shitmaster, not a dog. Yu opened his eyes and saw a light. He thought again that it was that dog blocking his window, so he shouted to send it away and tried to throw it off the bed with his hand. But at that moment, Shu Qian saw handcuffs on his hands. He finally woke up, but he couldn't understand what was happening, where he was, or what was wrong with him. Maybe it was a joke. Yu ended up in a prison in Xingzhou Prefecture. There was nothing there, just bare walls and floor. He was lying on a thin mat on the floor right in the middle of the prison room. Light was coming in from a small window. He was lying there looking at the massive shackles that bound his hands. Zhu leaned on his hands to get up. He wanted to remember what had happened and why he was here. But the last thing he remembered was getting drunk in a bar. How he had been with the guys until his head throbbed and hurt from the memories. He could not remember what happened next. Was he really that drunk? Shu wanted to tear his hair out from his helplessness. He was very angry. This anger shone in his eyes. Yu started screaming and swearing. At that moment, he wanted to forget everything and return to his childhood, where he was affectionately called Nin Yak. But he had no one to return to. His father died 19 years ago in the Battle of Shanghai, and his mother died of an illness. Since childhood, he was raised by his second uncle. After his parents died, Shu Qian was reborn in a new family. He persistently practiced martial arts, and at the age of 18, he achieved his incomparability. Using the connections of his second uncle, he became a guardian of order in the jurisdiction of the Jingzhou professorship. He was a policeman. Even in prison or after his rebirth, he remained a policeman. Zhu Qian was imprisoned because of his second uncle, who lost 150,000 liang of silver. The chests with the riches fell into the water, and after that no one could find the silver. The soldiers took out empty wooden boxes from the water. The second uncle was Shu Pingji, a 7th-class green-robed imperial swordsman. For several days he tiredly accompanied the tax cart to the Ministry of Revenue and Duties. The taxes were shackled in wooden chests. They were loaded onto horse-drawn carts. Together with my second uncle, several other guards accompanied the chests of silver. It was a very responsible business. After the loss of taxes, His Majesty was very angry and ordered Zhu Pingji's head to be chopped off. This was to happen exactly 5 days later. All this time, my second uncle was in prison, shackled. His hands and feet were shackled, and he was forced to his knees. He had to stand in this position for 5 days until he was executed. All other men in the family were ordered to be sent to the border. The women of the Pingji family were not left unpunished either. All the women were sent to a Jiafang women's prison. Because Shu Chudos was the nephew of Shu Pingji's second uncle, he was fired and thrown in jail as well. He ended up in the jail of the Jingzhou faculty. There were 2 days left before the execution of the second uncle. Shu Qian was furious. He had to save his family and, above all, his own skin. Shu did not know how to prove his case. After all, the world where they lived was ruled by a feudal dynasty. Human rights did not exist there. Everyone listened and obeyed the orders of the ruler. It was really the most backward place for Shu. But the place where Shu Qian was sent was even more terrible. It was a desert with a harsh climate. Most of the criminals who were sent to the border had not lived there for even 10 years. Suddenly, Shu decided to recall the spell. Maybe it would help him. He muttered something quietly.
He called for a system with a built-in destiny. Shu gently asked her to come out, but it was all in vain.
No one appeared before him, and he still continued to sit on the prison floor. Nothing was working. There was no system. Shu grabbed his head and squealed. He had to save his ass. Otherwise, he would live like a dog on the border. He remembered that he was at the peak of the greatness stage and had a strong physique. But in this world, he was caught because of his second uncle's mistake with the silver. The case is important, and many people are watching. You can't just run away like that. There will be no life anyway. And then Shu remembered the Dafeng law. It refers to good deeds that correct mistakes. He thought about it. His eyes lit up. He seemed to have found a solution to save his own skin. We need to find a way to get the silver back. He would take up the case and see it through to the end. Zhu's dreams sank to the bottom again. He remembered that he was in prison. Therefore, no one will allow him to look at the case files. Even if he shouts about it, the guards will simply stab him. Suddenly, Zhu heard someone walking down the hall. It was a guard and someone else. But Zhu couldn't tell who it was. Two people came to his cell. Behind the guard was someone in a white robe. The guard allowed them to talk while the glow stick was on. The man behind him thanked him politely. Zhu was sitting on the floor, his hands shackled. He was not ready to talk. He needed to come up with a plan to get the case files. But curiosity won out. Zhu looked up to see who had come to see him. The guard walked away. As promised, he gave us time to talk. The two boys' eyes met. You recognized the man in the white robe. It was his cousin, his second uncle's own son. His name was Shu Xinyan, or Shi Jiyu. He was a new Taoist scholar at the Yulnu Academy. Shi Jiyu was known as the King of Eloquence. His white robe suited Shi Jiyu very well. His hair was pulled back in a ponytail. His movements were restrained and very slow. Shi Jiyu put his hand on his arm and walked closer to the prison bars. He said that he had bought Shu Qian off. He paid 300 liang of silver for him, and now he can go free. Yuyan could not believe what he was hearing. He knew that the family had no money, and his relationship with his cousin had always been bad. Why such generosity? Dian also wondered why his cousin was free. After all, according to the law, after this type of crime, all the men in the family go to prison. Jiuyu was not ready to talk about his father or the lost silver. He was very cold and unconvinced. His eyes were looking nowhere, as if he wanted to end the conversation as soon as possible. But the guy admitted that he had been expelled from the academy, but he still had the protection of the academy's teachers. That is why he was not sent to prison. Zhu refused his cousin's help. He did not want him to bribe him out of prison. Running away is not a story about Shu Qian. Shi Jiuyu did not insist. He didn't want to lose the last 300 liang of silver either. So he decided to just give advice that his cousin should just keep his cool, because when he got to the border, his temperament would not get him anywhere. Zhu did not want to listen to his cousin's advice. He did not consider him an authority, so he didn't even continue the discussion. He was thinking of ways to save his own skin legally. Zijiuyu was arrogant. He also stood silently and waited for his cousin to beg him for help. He liked to be an authority and really wanted to be in demand even in such matters. Zhu realized that something was wrong with his cousin. With his temperament, he couldn't have just been expelled from the academy. Something worse had definitely happened there. Then Si Jiuyu decided to confess what really happened. He was not just expelled from the academy. He became a nobody, and no one can change that. Even if he has children and grandchildren after the situation with the silver, they will all be nobodies. Moreover, in 2 days, all the women of the Shu family will be sent to Jiaofan for humiliation, and Shu Xinyan himself, although he will remain living in the capital, will not be able to live a full life. Suddenly, Shu Xinyan's eyes were filled with regret. This was the first time he had ever looked like this. He really didn't know how he was going to live anymore. That was why he decided to ransom his cousin so that he could escape. This added at least a little bit of nobility and honor to him in the eyes of other people. And then Shi Jiuyu's eyes filled with hatred. This was how he usually looked. Zhu realized that he was not doing this ransom favor for him, but for himself. But it seemed that Si Jiuyu had lost interest in life. His life was about to become meaningless, so he decided to commit suicide. Yu realized this and wanted to stop him. He believed that he could save the whole family. Zijiuyu looked at his brother with a look of hope. He wanted to live a full life and was willing to do anything to make it happen. Zhu was determined and confident in his abilities. His gaze was fair and direct. He seemed to have figured out what he had to do to save his family. He did not want to openly admit that his life had lost its meaning, and he wanted to end it. He could hardly believe that his cousin would come up with something, because at first glance it seemed impossible, so he decided to just leave and end the conversation. Xiao turned his back on his brother and was going to run quickly so that he would not have time to stop him, but in the end he wished his cousin to move on, to live on no matter what, because his life is already over. Xiao prepares to escape from prison, but then Shu put his hand through the bars. He caught his cousin by the arm. He stopped him by force and said in a very confident voice that now was not the time to give up. Yu asked his cousin to bring him the dossier. He was referring to the case file on the loss of the silver. He needed to see this file, but Zhu did not know where to get it. So he decided to ask his cousin for help. Perhaps he knew something. Yu quickly unhooked his hand from his brother's and waved him away. He didn't understand why his brother needed the dossier. Zhu held onto the bars with both hands and tried to explain to his stupid cousin that he wanted to solve the case. Shu wanted to know what really happened. If he was going to die in prison, he had to know the real reason for his death and the death of his family. Xiao admitted that he had seen the dossier and read it, therefore he could tell his brother the entire contents. But Shu needed a document with a clear text, not a rough translation. Yu asked his brother to go and rewrite everything word for word for him. He had to know all the details of the case. Xiao stood for a few minutes and digested the information. He didn't know what to say to his cousin. But in the end, he decided to help him, and ran through the corridors of the prison to the office with the documents. Yu saw his cousin running. His boots pounded on the tiles of the corridor. It seems that he is not completely lost yet. It will be possible to communicate normally as a brother. SJU read the case file again. He read everything very carefully. He found out that in modern methods of criminal investigation, inspection of the scene, observation and exposure are 3 mandatory components. Zhu also knew this information. He analyzed it and ran it through his mind. Yu remembered that no one died because of the loss of the silver, but he and his entire family were in jail. Zhu hoped that the dossier would help him recreate some of the events. Zhu walked around the cold and empty prison room and tried to put all the information together in his head. Zhu realized that everything now depended on him. Whether he lived or died was up to him. The prison was quiet and peaceful. Only in the corridors could we hear any footsteps. It was Shi Juyu who came back. He approached Zhu's cell. He was holding something in the sleeve of his white robe. Juyu took out a large scroll and held it out through the cell bars. He copied everything word for word from the case file on the loss of the silver. He did everything as his cousin asked him to. Gao immediately took the scroll and wanted to study it as soon as possible. He sat down with his back to his cousin so that he would not disturb him and opened the scroll. Juyu said that he had to go now, but Shu didn't even hear him anymore. He was completely absorbed in the document. Juyu wanted to believe that Shu would fulfill his promise and solve all the mysteries. He was the last hope for a normal life. This time, Shi Juyu was definitely planning to leave the prison. He had already spent too much time there. Zhu was completely immersed in studying the case file. He read line by line. But he heard his cousin leave, and instead of saying goodbye, he told Shu to be careful. Zhu tried to concentrate on every word, every line, but it was very difficult for him to do so. Zhu even regretted that he wanted to listen to his cousin's retelling of the story. He couldn't make out his writing. His handwriting was certainly bad. Zhu peered at each symbol, but could barely make them out. But there was no room for error. He had to study everything in detail and find the culprits. From the scroll, Shu learned that his second uncle, the imperial swordsman Shu Pingji, had accompanied the silver shipment. At 4 o'clock, the wagon reached Guangyan Street. Immediately after the horses with a full wagon of silver pulled the cart over the bridge, a strong wind suddenly rose. The horses were very frightened and threw themselves into the water. After a while, there was an explosion. It happened somewhere deep underwater so that huge waves about 6 feet high were created. Zhu continued to read word by word. The case file said that the soldiers should immediately jump into the river to find the chests of silver, but they managed to find only 250 pieces of silver. All the other silver was gone. Zhu read and could not believe his eyes. His hands were shaking with excitement. He almost dropped the scroll from his hands. Yu seems to have realized what was going on. He seemed to have solved the mystery, but he had to think it over again. His head was already aching and sweat was rolling down his forehead. At that time, the palace was quiet and peaceful. The entrance to the palace was guarded by 2 stone lions, and the building was decorated with Chinese lanterns. There were 3 people in the palace. Silence reigned. Everyone was busy doing their own thing. The silence was broken by Governor Chen Hongguang. He coughed loudly. The governor was sitting on a wooden chair. He was dressed in a red robe. He was an older, respectable man whose opinion was listened to by everyone in the courtyard. He spoke slowly and very carefully. Chen Hongguang also rubbed his black beard all the time. This helped him to concentrate and think carefully about everything that had accumulated in his head. This time the governor was thinking about the lost silver. The saint ordered him to wait for the money to be returned before beheading Xu Pingji. There were only 2 days left. Until then, the governor was thinking about the theft and did not understand the motives. Their laws were clear. If one person broke the law, the whole family suffered. The governor's thoughts were interrupted by the fighter Li Yuchun. He was a powerful warrior. He used to work for the Imperial Intelligence Organization and had fought many people. He asked the governor if he had any news from Xu Pingji. The governor closed his eyes, put his hand on his arm, and thought about Xu Pingji's fate. The man continued to blabber on about how he had been unjustly accused. He said he didn't know where the money had gone. Suddenly, the imperial astronomer Chu Kaiwei joined the conversation. She said that she had looked at Xu Pingji using a divination technique, and the result showed that he was not lying. Chu Kaiwei was the youngest student in the empire, but her skills were trusted. She was not a stupid girl. All 3 of them sat in the room and thought about what they should do next. Chu Kaiwei was eating as usual. It was her favorite thing to do. Instead, the governor was thinking about how to improve their financial situation. They investigated the case and tortured Xu Pingji, but he denied his guilt. Li Yuchun added that thanks to his cooperation with the astronomer, the suspicion was ruled out, but the loss of taxes and failure to fulfill duties will not exempt Xu Pingji from the death penalty. The imperial astronomer Chu Kaiwei did not engage in conversation. She simply chewed on a bamboo stick. This chewing sounded like the warrior Li Yuchun. The fighter was annoyed by the fact that the girl ate very sloppily. She would bite down, and pieces of bamboo stick would fall right onto the table. The whole table was covered with scraps. One piece even fell to the floor. Soldier Li Yuchun squints his eyes. He carefully watched the piece of bamboo fly off the table. The soldier calculated its speed, and he twisted his hand. Magic happened. A whirlwind of air rose. He picked up a bamboo sliver, and he threw it right on the table. Li Yuchun was satisfied with his work. He loved cleanliness and order. Then he felt harmony and could think with a fresh head. Nothing distracted him. Suddenly I heard someone's footsteps. It was a servant who came in. He addressed the imperial astronomer Chu Kaiwei. The servant brought her a letter from a student, but most importantly, he brought her fresh buns. The girl immediately took the bun and took a bite, and then she took up the letter and began to read it carefully. Her people said that there was no demonic aura on the 20-mile journey to Hanoi. There was not even a trace of demonic energy on the shore. The governor was very angry when he heard this. His forehead wrinkled and his eyes became angry. The fighter was not happy with these findings either. He slammed his fist on the table in anger, and the always reserved governor started shouting at the top of his lungs. He did not understand where they were supposed to get the 1,000 silver pieces. They should have swum ashore long ago. 3 whole days had passed, and they had no trace of the thief. The governor did not know what to do if he did not find the money. The soldier thought about it and strained his brain. He picked up the report again and assumed that their investigation was going in the wrong direction. Maybe what happened was not the work of a monster, but the governor shouted even louder. He started waving his hands, saying that if there were no monsters, then where did the strong wind come from? At that moment, sitting on the floor of the Jingzhou prison, Xu Qian was reading the case file. He was very close to solving it. The governor was furious and did not understand why the silver had disappeared after it had been put into the water. Zhu Xian had already guessed what kind of magic had happened to the silver in the water. Now, he just had to figure out how to convey this information to the palace. Yu read the paragraph about the waves again carefully. It was described that they came from nowhere and were several feet high. It was assumed that it could have been an earthquake. There are monsters in this world. Demons have existed since ancient times. They hunt each other and people. On the edge of the eastern border, there is a mountain called Shivan. It is one of the largest demon settlements. This is the land of demons. 500 years ago, a group of inflammatory states led by Buddhists declared war on the land of demons in the east. The war lasted for a very long time. Everything around was destroyed. A sea of blood was shed. But after 100 years, the war ended with the defeat of the land of demons. Since then, the demons' fate was sealed. They went into the shadows and rarely reminded of themselves. Instead, the Buddhists began to develop. Then the Buddhist path flourished. The palace continued to speculate about who had stolen the taxes. All those present calmed their emotions, returned to common sense, and began to discuss the situation calmly again. Even if demons were involved, the governor did not understand why they needed tax money. Instead, the fighter said that demons always behaved strangely and did what they wanted. The imperial astronomer Chu Kaiwei was finishing her buns and wanted to say a few words as well, but her mouth was full. Finally, she chewed on it and suggested that maybe the demons were now eating silver. It looked a little strange. After all, human flesh has always been much tastier for them. Why would they need silver then? She wanted to say something else but realized that she was holding another bun in her hands that she urgently needed to finish. The governor was shocked by this glutton. After eating every last crumb, Chu Kaiwei finally calmed down and was ready to continue the conversation. She noted that silver is not as interesting to demons as a living person, but if someone needed silver from taxes, then organizing a robbery with the help of demons was a great idea. The governor liked Chu Kaiwei's way of thinking. He also noted that the demons could have been hired by someone. But the warrior had other questions about who could have given the demons such a task, and why exactly 1,000 secrets were stolen. The governor suggested that perhaps someone needed such a large sum of money. However, Chu Kaiwei did not understand why it was worth stealing tax money. Li Yuchun, a fighter, explained that the delivery route with taxes was chaotic. Xu Pingji did not start this route, but only continued the process. Perhaps the demons were able to set up an ambush in the river in advance. That's why Li Yuchun assumed that there must have been a spy in the escort to calculate every step. The soldier squinted his eyes. He wondered who the spy could be. It was very difficult to understand all this without the help of higher powers. Lin Yuchun suggested that we go to the Yunxian Academy and find a sage. When the imperial astronomer Chu Kaiwei heard about this proposal, she screamed in surprise and anger. She considered herself very powerful and knew many techniques. Chu Kaiwei was offended that someone underestimated her reading of qi, or did not understand and looked down on the Wangzi technique. She repeated once again that the soldiers who accompanied the tax silver to the crime scene came unknowingly. They did not know where the silver had gone. The soldier and the governor realized that it was inappropriate to express distrust of this girl. They looked over the scroll with the report again. Perhaps there was a clue somewhere in there. Chu Kaiwei is tired of being in the same room as such rude people. She had come here specifically to help, and her work had gone unappreciated. At sunset, she had to leave the capital and forget about this case. She had to leave the castle to find the princess. The only thing that had kept her locked up with these brutes was food. Chu Kaiwei's eyes would shine with joy whenever a new delicacy was brought to her. The cakes and buns were all very appetizing. The cook in the castle was the best in the world. The case was moving very slowly. Soldier Li Yuchun kept looking at the scroll with the report. It was as if he was going to see some new hidden fact there that he had not noticed before. The governor wanted to close the case as soon as possible. He suggested that Li Yuchun consult with Mr. Wei. The governor believed that another bright head and a different way of looking at things would make things move. Li Yuchun did not like this offer very much. He thought it was a test of his skills. After all, the case is not so complicated that it requires so many people. But the governor was very persistent. He realized that they had already reached a dead end on their own. And if the perpetrators were not punished and the silver was not found, the governor himself would be in trouble. Meanwhile, the prison was quiet and peaceful. In his cell, Shu sat on the cold floor. He was still scrutinizing the report on the silver theft, but these thoughts were already giving him a headache. Shu remembered his carefree past. Juyu was very popular with women, and all thanks to his cunning and charisma. He would copy poems and pass them off as his own when picking up girls. The girls loved it. They ran after Shu in herds. Juyu could win the heart of any girl, and then he could just use his finger to lure her away. Shu felt that he was irresistible, but after his rebirth, he ended up in prison. Shu would never have thought in his life that such a gift was waiting for him. He had to think about how to save his own skin. But if there are really demons involved in the case, he will not be able to do anything. Ju put his hand on his head. It was already cracking from all the information he had read, but the demon version was just a guess on the part of the palace. Ju decided that he needed to analyze the whole story himself, based only on facts, not on anyone's guesses. Juitu looked at the report again carefully. He needed to understand why the demons would steal silver from taxes. Even if they had a shortage of silver, why would they choose taxes to steal from? Xu had previously read in books that all female demons are very beautiful and have incredible bodies. Maybe there are cat girls or dog girls among them. Xu had to be careful not to let his attention wander to any unnecessary information. Suddenly, Zhu realized that there were two main suspicious episodes in the silver theft case. The first was that a strong demonic wind had blown, frightening the horses. Only cultivators knew how to use demonic wind. Ordinary soldiers could not even come close. It turns out that cultivators were involved in this. This then eliminates the second Uncle Shu from the circle of suspects, who accompanied the motorcade with the taxes. Yu also noticed the second thing, the explosion. Something exploded underground, causing waves to rise several feet. A blast wave during a cultivator battle is a common occurrence. But what is unusual is that there was no battle. This means that the explosion was not caused by anything, unless it was some kind of special distraction. Yu was very attentive to detail. He didn't miss even the smallest things. He remembered who often used explosions to achieve their goals. Yu had an epiphany. Among all the schools of cultivation, he knew just such a school. He had already encountered such a case in his practice. Yu realized why his second uncle and all his relatives were behind bars. The case was investigated too superficially, and the first people who came to hand were arrested. But in fact, the mystery was quite different. Yu closed his eyes. He tried to put the whole puzzle of the crime together in his head. He had to get away from the past. It was difficult. Druid Shu's eyes lit up. He realized that perhaps this was all set up by an ordinary person, and no demonic forces were involved. Zhu realized that perhaps the wind and explosions were a distraction, and the solution lies in completely different details. Shu was close to the truth. Suddenly, everything in Shu's mind came together like a puzzle. He realized why there had been an explosion underwater and the waves that had scared the horses. Zhu had to report everything to the palace as soon as possible. So he jumped into the cell and screamed at the top of his lungs. He called for the guards. The prison was quiet and peaceful, so the guards were frightened by this scream and immediately rushed to calm Shu down. When the guard approached Shu's cell, he stood on his feet, folding his arms and looking very pleased with himself. The guard didn't understand why he was so happy if he was about to die, and you don't get inspired before you die. But Shu was very arrogant, and asked the guard to tell the magistrate that he had new evidence in the case of the lost taxes. Shu smiled and gloated. He knew that everyone would be shocked to hear the solution. In the palace, the fighter and the governor continued their argument. The governor wanted to take the case away from Master Li so that he could go somewhere else for help. But the fighter Li was absolutely against it. Zhu Wei also tried to put her 5 cents into the argument, but no one listened to her. She suggested that perhaps the Count was involved in the theft. But if it's not true, then everyone will be in trouble. Chu Kaiwei began to laugh at this assumption. Soldier Li did not even want to assume that the Count was involved in any way. Therefore, he refrained from making any remarks and simply watched the situation in silence. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. A servant entered the hall and bowed low to show his respect. Everyone immediately paid attention to him. The servant said that he had information from the guards at the prison, where Shu Pingji's nephew, Shu Qian, was being held. He had new information about the case of the lost taxes. The governor could not believe what he was hearing. He ordered Shu Qian to be brought out of prison immediately. Zhu was sitting on the floor of the prison, shackled, waiting impatiently for the guards to come pick him up and take him to the palace. Finally, the moment came. Shu found himself in a palace where 3 people were waiting for him. He carefully looked at everyone present. Shu immediately realized that the man in the red robe was probably a magistrate, an official of the 4th rank. He sat still and did not even blink when Shu entered the room. This one with the embroidery on his chest seemed to Shu like a warrior on night watch. He was also very reserved and only glanced sideways at what was happening in the hall. And then Shu's eyes lit up. He saw an incredible blue-eyed girl. He thought she was incredibly pretty. Shu wondered if she was married. Zhu wanted to look at the girl from head to toe, so his gaze went down. But Shu immediately controlled his emotions. He realized that he hadn't come here to flirt. He had a much more important mission. Shu greeted everyone present. He bowed low to express his respect. Juyu was immediately approached by the governor. He was rude and harsh in his remarks. The governor said that while Shu Qian was in jail for 3 days, there were no leads in the case of the missing taxes. Therefore, if Shu decided to lie and distort some facts, he would be in trouble. Yu Qian was very smart. He understood that if they asked him directly about the evidence of the crime, it meant that they were desperate and could not understand the situation. But he did, and the fact that Shu was standing in the palace in front of these 3 was half the battle. Yu said that his cousin Xinyan got him a copy of the case file, which he read and found several suspicious facts. That's how he was able to get to the bottom of the truth. The governor and the soldier Li were shocked to hear this. They had been investigating the case for 3 days and had reached a dead end. How could some kid get to the bottom of the truth just by looking at the copies? Zhu Qian decided not to explain for a long time but to give out all the information at once. He noted that tax theft is not the work of a demon, but of an ordinary person. The governor laughed at first because he thought it was all a joke, and then he shouted for the guards to take the crook out and punish him with 200 lashes. This was not the kind of meeting Shu was expecting, so he asked to be heard to the end. But the governor would not even listen. He thought it was all nonsense because they had already found out that demons were to blame. Then the guard caught Shu by the arm, snapped it behind his back, and was about to drag him back to his cell. Shu realized that the governor must be in a bad mood right now. Suddenly, Soldier Li joined the conversation. He got up from his chair, but his footsteps were barely audible. Li's soldier stopped the guard, pushing him away with his hand and offering to listen to Shu Qian. Zhu did not wait long and told everything he had learned, namely that according to the city guard's report, his uncle arrived in the city at 5 a.m., and at 7, his team was on Guanggang Street. Out of nowhere, a demonic wind came up and frightened the horses, and they threw the wagon into the river. The governor interrupted Shu, saying that they knew this without him. That is why they concluded that demons were involved. But Shu continued. He said that wind and explosions are just cheap tricks. It is a way to divert attention from the main thing. And then all 3 in the room became very curious. They squinted their ears to make sure they didn't miss any important information, and the governor shouted for Shu to express his opinion faster. Zhu asked everyone to be careful. His uncle was accompanied by 150,000 silver coins. Shu asked the audience to think about how much they weighed. The governor did not understand what this had to do with anything. Zhu laughed that no one could count quickly, even though it was elementary. The wagon with the silver coins weighed 5,600 kilograms. Everyone thought about it because they didn't understand what Shu Qian was getting at. But Shu continued his math quest. Then he asked how far it was from the city gate to Guangan Street. Soldier Lee replied that it was 30 miles. Shu then asked how many crowded streets were on the route. Lee's soldier replied that there were 3. When Shu asked how fast the wagon was, Lee's soldier made it all up. That was the secret in the wagon. Soldier Lee also had an epiphany. The time was not right. Soldier Lee was the main one to say so. Betsy Lee ran all the information through his head. Guangang Street is 30 miles from the city gates. With 1 horse in a sled and 4 gas-packed streets on the way, it's not impossible to cover that distance in just 2 hours. The governor agreed that the silver was indeed delivered in a very short time. But they had witnesses who saw the horse and cart fall into the water. The governor asked how Shu could explain this. Fighter Lee had already fought to find the answer. He wanted to answer this question, but he was not 100% sure, so he was afraid to give the answer. Instead, Shu Qian was 100% sure of his innocence, so he mainly stated that the boxes accompanying his second uncle were not silver. The governor was very angry when he heard Shu's statement. He began to flail his arms and basically said that this was unheard of. Even if Uncle Shu didn't suspect anything, they had witnesses who saw the chests of silver. The governor was screaming so much that he was foaming at the mouth. He said that witnesses saw a horse fall into the water and silver falling out of the chests. How could people have seen silver? It is impossible. Zhu Qian wanted to smooth out his emotions and show everything clearly, so he bowed again to express his respect. Shu said that he was a loyal servant and was ready to lift the veil of secrecy for everyone. But for this, he needed some things. Shu asked for a brush and paper. They brought him everything he needed right away. Yishu began to paint with a brush. He was in a hurry, so he didn't even want to sit down at the table, but rather painted standing up. In a few minutes, Shu finished his writing. He took the letter to the governor and asked him to bring him everything that was written. The governor looked at the list carefully, but he had no idea why Shu Qian needed these things. The governor squinted and peered closely. It took him a while to make out the writing. Shu's handwriting was terrible. The imperial astronomer Chu Kaiwei was eager to see what was on the list. She literally snatched the paper out of the governor's hands. I also began to look at it carefully. Chu Kaiwei was very surprised and even indignant when she saw the usual things on the list. There was nothing special there. Soldier Lee also wanted to see what Shu had written. But the first thing Lee noticed was the bent corner of the leaf. Lee was a super perfectionist, and such little things annoyed him a lot and did not allow him to concentrate. That's why the first thing that Soldier Lee did was to straighten the corner of the paper. He was calm. He satisfied his inner perfectionist and was able to calmly see what was so interesting on the list. In the palace, they decided to fulfill Shu's wish and bring everything he needed. The governor personally laid everything out on the table and called Shu Qian over. He said that he expected a decent answer to all his previous statements. On the table were water, a candle, salt, a skewer, 2 clay porridges, rice paper, and iron rods. Before starting work, Shu decided to state his conditions. He asked if he could solve the case. Would His Majesty then be able to pardon his family? The governor thought and rubbed his beard. He remembered the Dafeng law. If it is proved that a person is innocent, he or she is subject to pardon. This answer satisfied Shu, and he returned to the table and wanted to start the experiment. Shu's legs were shackled so he could walk slowly, but while he was walking to the table, he was thinking that maybe the criminal didn't use explosive silver. But that was not the main thing now. Zhu had to find an alternative approach and explain how silver could explode. Zhu prepared for the experiment. The task was simple only at first glance. Zhu put his hand over his eyes. All of his school chemistry knowledge came flooding back to him, namely, the formula for sodium excretion. Zhu conducted the experiment very carefully. First, he dissolved the salt in water. Then he covered the clay duck with rice paper and began to slowly pour in the salt water. After straining, he heated the glass over a candle and stirred the water constantly with a skewer until the water evaporated. The process is closely monitored by all 3. The cold sodium has completely cooled down. Now the most important thing is left. We had to melt it all down with electricity, but in the old days there was a problem with that. So Shu turned to Chu Kaiwei. He squinted his eyes at her and asked if she was learning the celestial language. Chu Kai-wei thought for a second and then boldly answered yes. And she took out a magic amulet from her pocket. It was a golden amulet, with the yin and yang sign in the center. Only alchemists and their students could use such amulets. Chu Kai-wei boasted that her teacher was a chief alchemist. That's why she knows a lot of things too. She was surprised that this girl was a disciple of the chief alchemist himself, but he had a unique opportunity to test her skills. Shu asked her to help him melt the crystals on the plate. Chu Kai-wei was offended to hear this request. After all, only true alchemists could control fire, and she was only a 7th grader. But Chu Kai-wei didn't want to look like a clumsy girl in the eyes of everyone present. She decided to use the magic amulet her teacher had given her. Chu Kai-wei waved her hand and said an incantation from the magic amulet, and flames rose. She threw the flame directly at the sim before shouting at Shu to move away. The flame hit the target and began to burn even more. Shu started shouting for Chu Kai-wei to stop. He had to do one more manipulation with the metal sticks. Shu poured the shavings from them into a bowl, and then he calmly turned to Chu Kai-wei. He needed electricity, not fire. He needed to control the voltage so that it would not be too high. At this stage, it was easy to make a mistake, so he had to be very careful. Chu Kai-wei tried again. She waved her fingers and said the incantation, and a whirlwind of tension came out of the magic amulet. It was hard for her to control this process. The tension was too great, so Chu Kai-wei quickly threw this swirl into the bowl, almost hitting Shu. Yu shouted for Chu Kai-wei to stop. There was enough electricity. Zhu cautiously approached the table to see if everything had worked as he wanted. And in the plate he saw the sodium that had been successfully released. Shu was delighted that he was so fabulously lucky. There was enough tension and everything worked out on the first try. Zhu took a piece of paper and poured everything in the bowl onto it. Then he asked everyone to look closely at the result of the experiment. The governor, the soldier Li, and Chu Kai-wei stood and carefully examined the small bundle. It looked very similar to silver, but it was much lighter. Now the question arose whether someone could have used such a trick to counterfeit the silver in the chest. The governor took the piece and looked at it even more closely. He put it right up to his nose. Indeed, it looked like silver, but it was very light. If the horses were really carrying this instead of silver, then everything becomes clear. The governor invited Chu Kai-wei to examine the stone up close. Chu Kai-wei took a closer look, and also agreed that the stone looked very much like silver, but she was more interested in Shu's personality. She asked him directly if he was an alchemist. Yu denied it. He laughed and said he was just good at chemistry. But the governor was interested in another issue. Even if the silver was replaced, how the explosion happened. He started scratching his beard again. It helped him focus. All three of them stood there and could not understand how even such chemical silver could explode and disappear. They were sure that it was definitely because of the demons, but they were stopped again by Shu. He took the stone out of Chu Kai-wei's hands. He threw it into a bowl of water. The stone bubbled and the water began to steam. And then there was an explosion. The plate cracked and shattered into pieces. Something incredible happened. No one could believe their eyes. The governor had never seen anything like this before, so he was the most surprised. But Shu knew this would happen. He knew that counterfeit silver tarnishes when it comes into contact with water. Shu looked down at the audience and said that a chemical reaction had occurred. That is why the explosion occurred when the carriage and horse fell into the water. Soldier Li had also long ago guessed what really happened, but he decided to summarize it for the rest of us. It turns out that they were all fooled. The criminal deceived them with fake silver and magic wind. In this way, he shifted the blame from himself to the demons. Chu Kai-wei also immediately growled that her heavenly bond said there were no demons in this case, and they never lie. Soldier Li agreed that it would be worthwhile to trust this girl. Yu recalled that the soldiers managed to recover about 1,000 taels of silver from the water. Obviously, the real silver was on top of the boxes to cover the fake. Soldier Li was pleasantly surprised. Hu Tian was able to solve such a difficult case on his own, so he decided to praise him and frankly say that he had done a great and wonderful job. But Li's inner perfectionist saw Shu's rumpled clothes. His eye began to twitch from this imperfection. So Soldier Li patted Shu on the shoulder and told him once again that he was a good man. In fact, Soldier Lee was just smoothing out his wrinkled clothes. Zhu was very surprised by this gesture. But Lee's inner perfectionist was already pleased. It was clear why the carriage with the silver fell into the water and exploded. But for Soldier Lee, it was unclear where the real silver went. Zhu Kaiwei did not know how to investigate the case. It seemed to her that it would be easier to know the needle in the haystack. So, in order not to bother, she suggested that she report everything to His Majesty. Buetzi Li analyzed all the information he received. He emphasized that the treasury had passed through many hands, but if the silver had been changed immediately, someone would have noticed. It turns out that this must have happened shortly before the horse with the boxes of silver fell into the water. It was a new challenge for the governor, a new task that had to be solved immediately. It was already giving him a headache, and he did not want to get confused in yet another new version. He too tried to put all the puzzles together in his head, but he did not understand how the silver could have been switched during its transportation. The governor's eyes were already glowing with anger at this incomprehensible situation. Suddenly, the governor decided to find out for himself, to interrogate him himself. He shouted for a carriage to be brought to him immediately and started running for the exit. The governor was not ready to wait even a second. He shouted even louder for everyone to move immediately and follow his orders. He had to go, but no one knew where he was going. Zhu realized that he had done his job and was no longer needed. Womu also decided to remind himself by screaming. After the governor, Shu shouted at him to remember to fulfill his promise of pardon. But it seems the governor was not listening to anyone. He was in a great hurry. Zhu Xian hoped that the silver would be found before his sentencing, although his family's honor would be restored in any case. But the magistrate could take all the credit for himself. Shu put his hand on his arm and thought about his future. He did not know what awaited him. Well, Shu decided to leave everything to the luck of the draw. He looked at how beautiful the day was and how beautiful the courtyard was in the palace where he had been brought from prison. Suddenly, his thoughts of beauty were interrupted by Chu Kaiwei. She asked how Shu turned salt into silver. Suddenly, Chu Kaiwei realized that she was being rude and started looking for something in her purse. She pulled out a bamboo stick. She handed it to Shu. He was surprised to see Chu Kaiwei pull out a bamboo stick from such a small handbag. But Chu Kaiwei thought that Shu was hungry from the day's work, so she offered him something to eat. Shu smiled, thinking it was a bribe for information, and mostly laughed. Shu said that he had seen the secret of turning salt into silver in a secret manuscript. Chu Kaiwei wanted more information about what kind of manuscript it was and who wrote it. Shu laughed. He didn't want to admit that in fact all this information was in the book 9th grade chemistry. He decided to lie and said that the book had been destroyed, but he remembered its contents well. Then Shu decided to play on emotions and said with a pitiful face that he could not tell all the information because he was about to die, and it was very confusing and he could not think about anything else. Zhu Kaiwei realized that Shu was very cunning, but she was eager to find out all the information. However, alchemists had no right to interfere in politics and accusations. His Majesty had to decide his fate. Zhu was in a good mood. He was very pleased with himself. So he decided to offer Chu Kaiwei to take him on as an apprentice. He said that it would not be difficult for her master to take in even a servant with prison experience. Zhu Kaiwei did not understand the purpose of this conversation. She immediately realized that Shu was a warrior. Why would he change anything? Zhao Kun proudly declared that he simply admired the alchemy master's zeal. But in reality, he just needed connections in society. Chu Kaiwei didn't want to continue this pointless conversation. She just needed to know what the lost book was about. But Shu didn't want to tell her anything. He decided to just tease her and said that the book was quite complicated and that she needed more explanations. Chu Kaiwei was very angry. It seems that Shu thought she was stupid, but she thought she was the best of all. Zhu Yu was also tired of this conversation. He decided that he had to teach this arrogant girl a lesson. So Shu simply started naming the elements of the periodic table. But this information did not stick together. He said what came to his mind, but it didn't stick together. Zhu Kaiwei did not understand what he was saying. She tried to figure it out, but there were more questions than answers. The girl bit her lip, trying to catch at least some sense, but it was useless. He was talking nonsense. Finally, Zhu Kaiwei decided to stop it and hit Shu with a bamboo stick. She knew that he was just messing with her, so she decided to leave. Shu still wanted to stop her, but it was no use. Zhu Kaiwei just looked at him sideways. Finally, she said that only virgins are accepted into their ranks. Zhu Kaiwei did not want to hear anything else. She walked out of the palace. Yu still wanted to stop her and tell her that he too was still a virgin, but no one was listening to him anymore. Instead, a prison guard appeared. He caught Shu by the shoulder and said it was time for him to go back to his cell. 2 days passed. The city prison was quite quiet. 3 prison guards were walking down the corridor. They stopped near one of the cells. It was Yu Pingji's camera. Yu Pingji was sitting on the ground. He looked up at the guards and immediately realized that they had come for his soul. The time must have come. His wife and daughters were sitting in the cell opposite him. They too realized that SBA Pinja's life was over. The wife wanted to say goodbye, so she came closer and caught the bars with her hands. Zhu Pingji's wife cried and asked him to promise her that when he died, they would meet in the next life. The children could not hold back their tears either. The youngest daughter, of course. Zhu Pingji apologized. He had let his family and his nephew down, and then he shouted that he would be faithful to his wife in the next life. Zhu Pingji could never have imagined that his life would end like this. He was crying. Tears were streaming down his cheeks. Zhu Pingji was a loyal servant of his country. He was innocent, so he had no regrets. He was preparing to die with dignity, to accept this death like a true warrior. But suddenly he heard from the guards that he was free. Zhu Pingji asked if he had heard it wrong, but the guards told him again that he was free and even gave him his uniform. Zhu Pingji and his family did not understand what was happening. They could not say a word. My wife immediately remembered their son, Xinyan. Perhaps he pulled the strings and they were all released. She was proud that even the court listened to her son. The woman recalled that his son's teacher was a member of the Ministry of Punishment under the Yan Jin. But Zhu Pingji realized that something didn't add up. They gave him his uniform back, and usually, when pardoned, the position is not returned. Zhu Pingji decided to ask the guards directly why he was pardoned. The officer said that the case of tax loss was closed, and the silver was found. The officer then voiced Defen's law for the person accused of a crime. Zhu Pingji continued the sentence. His relative could intercede. His wife shouted that it was definitely their son who did it. She and her husband cried even more because their son had helped them get the silver back. They were amazed at how he had dealt with the demons, but the woman always knew that she had raised a real man. The wife also attacked her husband for not teaching her son martial arts. Instead, he taught his nephew, Shu Qian, but suddenly their dialogue was interrupted by an officer. He said that Zhu Pingji was released from prison by their nephew, Shu Qian. The officer took out an order to read out. It said that silver had been discovered with the help of Shu Qian. Yu Qian signed all the papers and waited for his family outside. His fingerprints were clearly visible on the document. My uncle was pleasantly surprised to hear the news. My aunt was in complete shock. She began to shake with rage. She had hoped for her son's courage, but her worthless nephew turned out to be the brave one. The woman could not contain her emotions and her anger. She didn't understand how Shu Qian could have gotten away with anything. He was supposed to be behind bars just like them. The woman was so furious that she did not throw off her younger daughter, who was hanging on her shoulders. Meanwhile, it was sunny outside. Under the walls of the city prison, Shu Qian was waiting for his relatives. He was standing right in front of the front door. No one came out of prison for a long time. Zhu was beginning to wonder if everything was okay there. Suddenly, Shu Qian saw the door opening. His second uncle and his family were released from prison. His youngest daughter was the first to make herself known. She shouted that she was very hungry. The uncle approached his nephew. He was happy to see him, and my aunt was trying to find the words in her head. She had to somehow gather herself and thank him for the liberation. but she was not ready for this. Yu Qian waved to his relatives. He was happy to see them. Shu Qian was especially happy with his great-uncle. He smiled sincerely at him. My uncle had never seen his nephew so happy. My uncle started to cry. He could hardly hold back his tears. In his joy, the uncle punched his nephew's shoulder with all his might. Shu was thrown to the side. He almost fell. Yu Qian reminded him that his uncle was one level above him and therefore stronger. He should be more restrained. Otherwise, his beloved nephew might lose his teeth. Yu Qian realized that although there was not much difference between them, his uncle was much stronger. Therefore, he still needed to study and study to gain such strength. Suddenly, Shu Qian saw his cousin, Shu Linye. She was incredibly beautiful. Zhu Yan could not remember anything about his cousin. They probably didn't talk much. Because of his aunt, Shu Yan rarely talked to any of his family. This is probably why she and her cousin were not friends, although they could have been, because they were almost the same age. Zhu Linye also looked at Shu Qian with love. She was glad to have such a brother. Suddenly someone began to approach Shu Qian. The little legs ran very fast and stopped right next to Shu. Zhu looked down and saw his youngest cousin, Shu Linyi. Yu Qian remembered that he used to play with this little naughty girl a lot. But now she was screaming like a baby, that she was hungry. Zhu Qian leaned over and apologized for leaving the candy at home. He could not bring them with him, because he had only recently been released from prison. Shu Linyi did not know what prison was. She didn't care. She was just hungry. Shu Qian smiled at her, but the little girl was not laughing. She asked if her other brother had brought her candy, but there was no one else around. No one else came to meet them. Shu Linyi was very upset. Yu Qian realized that this little girl was the complete opposite of her mother. She is kind and sincere, unlike her mother. Zhu Qian's aunt's name was Li Ru. She was a haughty 35-year-old woman. When she was released, she barely managed to squeeze out a thank you in Shu Qian's direction. She didn't even look at him. She just looked away. Zhu Qian remembered how cruel and stingy his aunt was. Every time she yelled that it cost 100 taels a year to educate him. She didn't want to pay that kind of money, so she tried her best to drive Zhu Qian out of the house. Then Shu Qian promised her and himself that he would become rich. He would make it on his own, and his aunt would regret ever having behaved like that. That day seems to have come when Zhu Qian wiped his aunt's nose. He laughed and asked her to save her gratitude until they got home, but his aunt did not want to see him in her house. But my uncle liked the idea. He was really looking forward to going home. Yu's house was large. The front gate was guarded by 2 stone lions, and the gate itself was wooden and strong. But after the incident with the silver and the prison, the door was sealed. 2 stickers were neatly glued crosswise. Suddenly, someone unknown appeared in front of the house. He decided to be unceremonious and simply kicked the sealed door off. And then he boldly went into the yard. The yard was large and tidy. The man walked slowly, as if he was afraid to meet someone. Finally, he came to the front door, and he stopped. He put his hand on the door, as if hoping that someone would open it for him and be happy to see him. It turns out that his uncle's own son, Shu Xinyan, came to the house. He ran to the backyard, and on the way he was reminiscing all the way. Shu Xinyan was carrying a jug of water with him. He mentioned that he learned to read at the age of 3. At the age of 5, he was already quoting the classics, and at 10, he knew them by heart. By the age of 14, Shu Xinyan had entered the Yunlu Academy. At the age of 18, he became a scientist. Yu Xinyan walked over to a tree in the backyard, and he sadly realized that he was gifted. But this is not enough for a happy life. Veins appeared on Shu Xinyan's arms. He was very disappointed in himself and the world. In the end, Shu Xinyan decided that he would rather die with honor than suffer humiliation. He lifted the jug of the famous substance high above his head and drank it all. The jug fell and broke. The capital city of Dafan was known as the best city in the world. It was a city washed by water, with spacious streets and beautiful houses. Dafan was an ancient city. The Dafan Chronicle says that once upon a time 96 million people lived there. It is now in its 36th year, and more than 2 million people live in the city. Therefore, the wide streets are always crowded. Among such a crowded street, the Yu family was returning home from prison. When Zhu Qian approached the house, he noticed that the gate was sealed, but someone had already torn the sticker off. He assumed that somebody had already found a buyer for the house. After all, real estate prices here are quite high. My uncle entered the yard first. Zhu Qian continued to evaluate the property. He calculated that this house and the surrounding area would cost about 5,000 taels. Zhu Qian looked around and wondered how much tax his uncle paid. He calculated that the tax would be about 1,500 taels. Zhu did not understand why such questions were arising in his mind, and why he needed to count all the prices. While Zhu Qian was trying to sort out his thoughts, his uncle and aunt were worried about their own son. The uncle recalled that his son had promised to do something. Perhaps he is doing just that now, and does not know that they are already free. Zhu Qian recalled that his uncle and aunt's own son wanted to commit suicide because he could not save his family. He will be surprised to see everyone here. In prison, Xu Xinyan told Zhu Qian that he did not want to live as a nobody. He would rather die as a human being. Meanwhile, in the backyard, Xu Xinyan was writing a farewell letter. He quickly tried to put all his thoughts on paper and get it over with. The uncle and aunt decided to inspect the house in the hope of finding their son somewhere. But Xu Xinyan was already preparing to take his last breath. Xu Xinyan climbed onto a chair near a tree. He realized that these were his last minutes. He was scared, but there was no other way out. Xu Xinyan decided to let his hair down. Metal jewelry fell off my head. Her long dark hair was swaying in the wind. Xu Xinyan ran his fingers through his hair. His life was now hanging in the balance as well. Then he basically screamed. His uncle and aunt heard this scream. They realized that something was happening to their son. Xu Xinyan was caught by a rope that he had previously tied to a tree. Then he tried to tighten the noose around his neck. Xu Xinyan was very scared. He closed his eyes. The noose did not fit on his head. This began to annoy Xu Xinyan. He opened his eyes and saw his family in front of him. Uncle Auntie and the two Chesters watched Xu Xinyan trying to tighten the noose around his neck, and did not understand what was happening. Everyone was shocked by what they saw. Only my mother tried to squeeze out a word to distract Xu Xinyan's attention. Xu Xinyan did not expect such a meeting. In the end, he just lost consciousness and fell down. His mother and older sister immediately rushed to him. Xu Xinyan lay on a cold stone and was afraid to open his eyes. He was crying and could not stop. Everyone wanted to help and comfort him. No one even noticed how the wind stole his last farewell note. In the note, Xu Xinyan wrote that he was born in vain, and that he no longer had a future. Then Xu Xinyan regretted that he had not hanged himself a minute earlier. There are many ways of cultivation in this world. There are alchemists, scientists, Buddhists, Taoists, witches, and gu masters. The first generation of astronomers split society into classes. Xu Qian was on the 9th level, the kingdom of essence. And his uncle was on the 8th level, the realm of qi. There were many levels. Xu Qian knew the most about the degree of alchemists, because they belonged to the highest clan of society. Alchemists were also great inventors. They made both weapons and household items. It was evening in the city of Dafan. Xu Qian was taking a hot bath at his uncle's house, and trying to figure out why there were so many thoughts in his head that didn't fit together. Then Xu looked at his hands, and threw them to his reflection in the water. He was handsome. Not a Hollywood actor, of course, but not bad either. But only Xu Qian did not remember anything about the last moments of the body's owner. Jingyan described what his life was like before his reincarnation. After leaving the police force, he chose a quiet life. He wanted to become an ordinary family man. His life was very monotonous. Loans, family, children, blah, blah, blah. Until he was betrayed, everything was going on as usual. The last thing Xu Qian remembered from his past life was celebrating his dismissal from work with his brothers in arms. He drank a lot. He gave up the ghost of alcohol poisoning. He never thought that this is how his life would end. Xu Qian returned from his memories to reality. He punched the water to regain consciousness. Xu Qian became a school of himself. He had just broken into the middle class and found himself back in feudal society. And even after Yu managed to get out of prison, he could hardly be called lucky. In his previous life, he had 600,000 left in his bank account. It was hard to start a new life knowing that. knowing that you can't use this money. He hoped that the money would at least be transferred to his parents. Zhu also recalled his school days, how he never won a single soccer match. Zhu remembered that he still had 120 gigabytes of women's nudes on his hard drive. His dad would be so happy when he found them. Zhu blushed at the thought of his past life. It was already dark outside. Suddenly, someone knocked on Zhu's door. It was a maid. She said that Zhu was already waiting for dinner. The maid stood at the door and waited for an answer. Zhu thought for a few minutes and said he would be right there. The maid's name was Lu. She was sold to the Zhu family at the age of 10. After everyone from the Zhu family was arrested, the maids were dismissed. No one knew they would return so soon, just 5 days later. Liu Ye overheard the landlady saying that they were released thanks to Su Qian. That's why the maid looked at him with incredible admiration. Zhu Yan put on his robe and went out into the hallway. He was ready for dinner. When the maid saw Zhu, she was embarrassed and ashamed. And on the way, Zhu asked the maid not to call him master. The maid was surprised by this request because he was a master. On the way, the maid told him that the master and madam were having a big fight. Zhu was very curious about what had happened. He stopped for a minute. Lu said that madame was interested in where the taxes had gone and who had stolen them, but the master could not find the right answer for her. That is why madame was very angry. Lu wondered if Zhu knew who had stolen the taxes. Zhu wondered what he should say. Zhu remembered what he had told his uncle when they were returning home from prison. He told his uncle that the taxes had been replaced with counterfeit ones shortly before the horses fell into the water. Zhu put his hand on his arm and replayed the entire conversation in his head. After the conversation with her uncle, the girl thought about it. She realized that her husband knew something, but did not want to tell her. Meanwhile, Zhu and the maid were already entering the room where the whole family was about to have dinner. Every teenager has several awkward moments in their life. The first one is when parents walk into the room, and their hands are occupied with something else. The second moment is when a young teacher walks by, and you're just discussing her incredible ass with the guys. And the third moment is when your diary with dirty fantasies becomes available to the public. And also the awkward moment when he could not accept death with dignity, but he had already died inside. This is how Xu Xinyan, the native son of his uncle and aunt, reflected on his life and suicide attempt. His eyes were empty, just a body without a soul performing mechanical actions. The whole Xu family was sitting around the table, but everyone was incredibly tired. All except the youngest daughter, Xulin. Xulin was screaming at the top of her lungs. It was impossible to listen to her. During the hysteria, Su Qian came into the room with a maid. Madame was very happy that the maid had come. She could no longer bear to listen to her daughter's tantrums, so she asked the maid to take the little brat away. Xu Qian stroked Xu Lin's head. She immediately switched and calmed down. Yu leaned over and asked his little sister if she was okay. Yu Qian's look was very kind and friendly. Julien was also happy to see her brother. And then Xu Lin shouted loudly that her mother was a real liar. She promised her that when they got home, they would go to Gai Tower. The aunt tried to explain that her little girl must have gotten something wrong, but it was hard to do. At that moment, my uncle was quietly drinking tea, but he was also affected by this situation when Xu Lin shouted that it was he who had told a lot about the Gai Tower. Gai Tower is the most expensive restaurant in the city. Not everyone can afford to dine there, but little Xu Lin had already been there once and liked it very much. She knew all the dishes on the menu by heart, although Xu Lin could not boast of a good memory because she even confused the names of her brothers. In fact, the fact that Xu Lin was being capricious and screaming across the room worked to her uncle's advantage. He was finally able to divert his aunt's attention from the missing silver. He felt better that they would finally leave him alone with any questions about taxes. Xu Van noticed how well his uncle had shifted his attention. He knew his uncle was a good strategist. The aunt clutched her head. She couldn't listen to her youngest daughter's whining anymore. She had indeed promised little Xu Lin in prison that she would take her to Gaia Tower, but only to comfort her in prison. Her aunt thought they would never get out of that damned prison. Yu Yuken decided to shame his aunt. With a smile, he said that it was very bad to lie to children. Suddenly, someone clung to Shu Qian's robe with both hands. It was his sister Shu Lin who climbed into his arms. She began to ask Shu Qian to take her to the Guy Tower. She looked at him with such a sincere, childlike look. It was hard to refuse this sweet girl. But dinner for just one in this restaurant cost a lot of money. So Shu Qian simply took his sister by the skin of her teeth and handed her to a maid to take her away. The maid took the girl away, but on the way she would not calm down and kept screaming. Shu was no longer bothered by this. He calmly sat down at the table and began to eat dinner. Finally, the table became quiet, and everyone was able to eat in peace. For now, Shu Qian calmly shook them. The aunt again hurt my uncle. She demanded that he start the conversation first. The uncle had to talk to his own son, but he did not know how to start this conversation. He was ashamed to ask anything. Although Shu Xinyan was present at the dinner, he did not hear or see anyone. He died inside after what happened. Zhu Xian was not interested in these family disputes. He calmly ate his rice. Suddenly he looked up and saw her, his cousin Lin Ye. He stared at her as if mesmerized. Lin Ye did not like it. She asked me not to stare at her. After a few seconds, the girl realized that she was being too rude. After all, a few hours ago, Shu Qian had rescued their family from prison. So Lin Ye decided to take the conversation in a different direction and asked how Shu Qian solved the tax case. Zhu Gen was very pleased with himself and his work, so he simply answered boldly that he had done everything easily. Because there are no perfect crimes, mistakes always happen. The main thing in an investigation is to find these mistakes and put them together into a coherent picture. Shu Qian's eyes were burning as he talked about this crime. The stories about solving the crime brought Shu Xinyan back to life for a few minutes. He also wondered how his cousin had managed to investigate the case. Zhu Xinan listened attentively. It turned out to be simple. The first discrepancy was in the route and the speed at which the carriage was traveling. It was well after midnight by the time they were talking outside. Zhu Yinan was angry with himself that he was not the one who investigated the case. It turned out that there was nothing complicated about it. Zhu Yinan could not squeeze out many words. He merely remarked that his brother had done a good job. Lin Ye listened carefully to every word and admired it. She thought that her cousin was simply incredible. She did not understand anything, but she was very interested in listening to him. Zhu Qian was also very pleased with himself. It was evident in his eyes. My uncle decided to add his 5 cents to the conversation. He hit the table with his hand and shouted that he had finally realized where the dog was buried. Uncle Shu Xinyan's own son was surprised by this behavior. He knew that his dad would never have thought of this on his own. My aunt also publicly shamed my uncle, so he was embarrassed. My aunt said that my uncle and math were incompatible. She said that her uncle didn't even know how the scales worked, and that numbers were responsible for them. These ridiculous accusations were interrupted by Shu Qian. He asked his uncle if he remembered whether the guards who counted the silver wore gloves. My uncle thought about it. He did not remember. Perhaps they were. Zhu Qian asked why his uncle did not mention this detail to the world. My uncle replied that he thought it was nothing, but he remembered that that evening a guy named Lu gave him some homemade wine. Although he was not a wine drinker, he gladly tried it. So sip by sip, my uncle drank every last drop. As for the gloves in the guard's hands, if it weren't for Shu Qian, my uncle would never have noticed. Zhu Xian was angry that his uncle was so inattentive and missed such important details. If he had mentioned this in the case file right away, it would have been much easier to investigate. Shu Xinyan watched the conversation closely. He realized that the person who had drunk his father was probably the criminal who had stolen the silver. My uncle was of the same opinion. He strained to remember the face of the man who brought him the wine. The whole family was waiting for some detailed description from the uncle, and perhaps a clear surname and name. But my uncle could not describe the man in detail. He just felt very offended that his family almost died because of his inattention and stupidity. My uncle was very sorry that he had set his men up like that. The uncle looked at his nephew. He looked so much like his father, my uncle's brother. My uncle recalled how they fought side by side with Shu Qian's father in the battle of the mountains and the sea. They vowed to return alive and reach the top of the mountain together. Shu Qian listened to his uncle speak lovingly of his father, but the battle was ruthless, and Shu Qian's father died in his brother's arms. Before he died, he asked his brother to take care of his son. After this battle, Dauphin became the most powerful land. Many neighboring countries submitted to the Dauphin and paid tribute to them. This mighty battle for the right to rule took place over 20 years. Many soldiers died then. Millions died in the 6 months of fighting. The whole land was covered in blood. My uncle recalled that he too could have died in that battle, but my brother took the brunt of it. So now it is his duty to take care of Shu Qian, just like he promised his brother. Shu Qian listened to his father and almost cried. He realized why his uncle had taught him the craft of war so diligently, because it was his father's last will and testament, and my uncle wanted to replace Shu Qian with his father. The aunt decided to ruin this idyll. She was always unhappy when my uncle spent too much time with Shu Qian, but my uncle did not want to listen to these empty accusations. He was sick of this annoying woman. Yorukan laughed. He had always known that his aunt was jealous of her husband's nephew. She thinks he is more important to her husband than her own son. But my aunt yelled at Shu Qian to shut his lousy mouth. She really did not like him very much. Shu Qian laughed that he could make his aunt so angry with a half-turn. My uncle banged on the table and stopped these ridiculous accusations. My uncle emphasized that he had not survived the war to hear these quarrels, and almost cried. This behavior surprised his wife. She was used to seeing a manly man around her, not some crybaby. The little naughty girl, Shu Lin, returned to the room. She was hungry as usual, so she decided to have dinner at home. It was more satisfying than just dreaming of eating at an expensive restaurant. Little Shu Lin sat across from her mother. She was spoon-feeding her, and Shu Lin opened her mouth wide so that not even a crumb would fall. Suddenly, the girl asked why they were taken to that black room and not even allowed to eat. Everyone present realized that the girl had not realized that she was in prison. It was a good thing. Why should kids know about such places? My uncle caught himself and could forgive himself that his children had gone through such hell. Even if it was for 5 days, they were in prison, and it was all because of him. Julin loved to talk as much as she loved to eat. She said that yesterday she woke up very hungry and caught a bug. The girl described what kind of beetle it was and pointed to the horns with her fingers. This is how she demonstrated that the beetle had antennae. Shu Lin was so excited to tell us about it, as if she had found gold and not a beetle. My uncle and aunt felt sorry for their child. She was so young and had already been through so much. The aunt was worried that Zhu Lin had eaten that bug, so she asked her directly what she had done with it. But the girl laughed and answered that she heard her mother's tummy rumbling, so she put the beetle in her mother's mouth and she ate it. And her aunt almost threw up when she heard that. My aunt was even glad that she was asleep and did not remember what the bug tasted like, because she still wanted to throw up. It was a good thing that everyone at the table had already eaten, because no one wanted to look at the food and think about it after the story of the beetle. While the city slept, the lights were on in the astronomer's tower. Someone was still working there. They were alchemists who had their office in the astronomer's tower on the 7th floor. The young alchemists divided into teams, and each tried to extract a silver-like stone from salt water. But after several attempts, no one succeeded. Someone poured too much water, someone added too much salt, someone overdid it with the tension. No matter how many attempts were made, they all failed. Out of despair, the alchemists began to cry. It was a very difficult experiment that no one had succeeded in. They were waiting for Chu Kaowei. Maybe she could do it. Chu Kaowei recalled that she too had broken down in this experiment when she was processing silver with fire. The fact is that when the tax theft case was solved, His Majesty decided that counterfeit silver was an incredible material. That's why the alchemists were ordered to reveal the secret of how this silver was created. Now the alchemists worked day and night to uncover the secret of creating a stone similar to silver, but no one succeeded. All the alchemists experimented, but their experiments only led to tears. Suddenly Ku Chaowei appeared in the office. The alchemists were very happy, because she was the only one who had seen how the fake silver was created. Ku Chaowei did not want to share this secret with anyone. She didn't succeed the first time either. She just had to be persistent and experiment a lot. The alchemists were ready to carry Ku Chao-wei in their arms, if only she would reveal all the cards and teach them this powerful science of transformation. Almost all the necessary ingredients for the experiment were on the table. The alchemists begged Ku Chao-wei to have mercy and show them everything at least once. Ku Chao-wei noted that the transformation process is not really difficult. She succeeded in the palace on the first try, but Ku Chao-wei forgot to tell the alchemists that she had tried to do it again, and failed. She thought it might be the same this time, so she was very embarrassed. Nevertheless, Ku Chao-wei decided to capitalize on her moments of fame. She climbed to the top of the podium. She then promised to teach everyone present the recipe for creating a stone that looks like silver, and she will do it only today, because today is a special day. The alchemists listened attentively and were afraid to even blink, lest they miss some important detail. They were all holding their breath. Ku Chao-wei took a deep breath and exhaled, and she gave out the elements of the periodic table at the top of her lungs. This information was not held in a pile, but was simply a set of formulas. Hearing this, the chemists almost fell over. They did not understand what this girl was saying. What was this set of letters and numbers? How they were supposed to create a stone that looked like silver? No one, absolutely no one, understood anything. One of the alchemists shouted that no one understood this recipe. Ku Chao-wei knew this. She herself did not understand anything she said, but she would be very pleased with herself in the eyes of others. She looked super smart. But some of the alchemists were delighted. They applauded and said that the person who wrote this recipe was very talented. Then they asked Ku Chao-wei, who told her the recipe. They wondered if she had met a master of alchemy, and he had revealed his knowledge. Of course, Ku Chao-wei was not going to tell anyone the truth about the imprisoned boy who wanted to save his family so badly. But nothing came to her mind. She answered dryly that the person who had given her this knowledge was Xu Qian. He is Xu Pingji's nephew. He is a warrior. That's all she knew about him. The alchemists laughed. They did not want to learn from some warrior. There were enough smart alchemists in their astrometric tower to manage on their own and figure out the recipe. Otherwise, they would be laughed at for being smarter than the alchemists themselves. In the cultivation system of this world, there was a so-called goal of humiliation, where Taoists look down on Buddhists. Buddhists look down on alchemists. Alchemists humiliate witches. The witches humiliate the masters. And the masters are alchemists, but they all share a common sense of humiliation for the soldiers. The alchemists considered warriors to be mere garbage, unworthy of anything. Nevertheless, the alchemists decided to ask Ku Chao-wei to help them with this experiment, since she had already come, and to show the real process of transformation. But Ku Chao-wei was afraid that she would fail, so she just left and promised to show it to her some other time. Ku Chao-wei ran very fast so that no one could stop her. She realized that she did not know anything, and could not teach someone else how to turn a stone like silver. On the roof of the astronomer's tower there was a floor for stargazing. It was an open terrace overlooking the entire city, and in the center was a large sign, Yin and Yang. The teacher liked to rest on this terrace. He usually didn't do anything serious. He liked to sit on the terrace, drink, and look at the city and the stars. He always said that watching people and stars is the most important job for an alchemist, and this teacher did not like to be disturbed by anyone. Ku Chao-wei also went up to the terrace, hoping that no one was there. She was eating as usual. She always had her bag of food with her. The teacher heard someone coming upstairs. He immediately recognized Kaveh by the smell of the food. Kaveh did not expect to see a teacher here. She almost dropped her bag of food out of surprise, so she was not very happy to see him. The teacher asked if the emperor had rewarded her after solving the case of the missing taxes. Chavi said yes. He gave her silver, silk, and satin. The teacher and Ku Chao-wei stood at a distance for a long time and waited for the other to make the first move. Then Ku Chao-wei decided to come closer to the teacher and sit down next to him. She continued to eat her food and even gave it to her teacher. Chavi asked if her teacher knew what fake silver was, but the teacher honestly admitted that he did not know. Ku Chao-wei was surprised. Are there things her teacher doesn't know about? He is such a powerful alchemist. The teacher watched the birds flying over the city. and admitted that he did not know many things. For example, the teacher does not know where the thieves went 10 years ago. Chave often heard her teacher talk about some thieves, but she never heard what they stole. The teacher stepped over the bench and walked closer to the edge of the terrace. Chave was a little afraid of what he was going to do. The teacher slowly moved to the very edge of the observation deck and told us that the things these thieves stole were incredible. Chave knew that her teacher knew everything, so she asked him again if he knew who made the fake silver. Only an alchemist could do this, but all alchemists give birth here in the tower. Obviously, the person who created the fake silver has something to do with alchemists. The teacher quietly muttered that an alchemist was definitely involved in the crime. For this crime required knowledge of alchemy, and it seems the teacher knew who helped steal and counterfeit the silver, but he didn't plan to tell anyone about it. Meanwhile, morning came. The corridor of the police station, all the policemen stopped and froze. It was as if they had seen a ghost. The police were scared, but they wanted to check if it was a living creature or just a figment of their imagination. Zhu Qian appeared in front of them in his uniform. He stood with his head proudly raised, his arms at his sides. The uniform fit him perfectly, as if he had been born in it. His gaze was confident and direct. Even his hair was blowing perfectly in the wind. The policeman pointed at him and did not believe that he was a living person. It seemed like someone was trying to play a trick on them. The police were scared because they really thought it was a ghost, but they quickly came to their senses. A living person was standing in front of them. Seeing the surprise of his colleagues, Zhu Qian decided to make a joke. He smiled sarcastically. He said he was a walking dead man. He squinted his eyes and growled through his teeth, as if he had just come out of hell. Chief Li seemed to believe this lie and fainted for a second. But Zhu Qian's laughter quickly brought him back to reality. Qian said that he was reclining. The police did not understand what the hell he was doing here. After all, he was supposed to be in jail, and by now he should have been sent to the border. Qian said that he received a pardon because he solved the case of the silver theft. Qian said that his pardon had not yet been announced anywhere, so he personally brought the documents confirming this and presented them to Chief Li. Chief Li ordered him to get in line. He did the morning roll call and left the room. The police officers were actually happy to see Chen. They patted him on the shoulder to show their respect. The policemen were waiting for Chen to sign in after his shift. It's not every day that you escape the death penalty. The policeman said that a new girl had just arrived at the brothel. He offered to go there. But Chen didn't want to spend that much money. He was only willing to splurge on beer. Guillen apologized and said that he would sign up some other time, because now there is no money. Their family is a little tight with money right now. Then Chen saw something shining on the floor. He had to immediately think of a way to pick it up without being seen. Zhu was not mistaken. There was money on the floor. He quickly covered the discovery with his boot. Suddenly someone entered the police station. It was Li's boss. He called Mr. Wang to the magistrate's residence. Mr. Wang grabbed his head. He knew that he was not going to have an easy conversation. There would be shouting and mockery, that the police could not solve the case. They are not doing their job. All the other policemen were looking on and also expected some bad outcome from this conversation. Meanwhile, Qian stood behind them. He quickly bent down. He took out the money he had hidden under his boot. No one noticed that he had picked something up from the ground. Zhu Qian asked what had happened. Why was everyone so worried? It turned out that while Yu Qian was serving his sentence, a murder had taken place on Kangping Street. A wealthy merchant was also killed. He was found in a pool of his own blood. Because of this murder, the master is very angry, so now every day he calls Van's head to his office. The police have been trying to solve the case for several days now, but to no avail. They have no clue who it could be, and who could have hurt the merchant so badly that he deserved to die in his own home. Qian wondered why there was so much attention to an ordinary trader. Perhaps he was the master's matchmaker. Otherwise, why would he be so angry and call their boss on the carpet every day? Why is this case so special to the master? Shu thought about it. Perhaps there was some kind of profit in it and he could win something too. He had to look into the case file in more detail. Another police officer said that they knew that the trader had ties to an influential official. Zhu Qian thought about it. He remembered that this was the year of the white mouse. This means that all officials must be recertified. Once every 3 years, all Dauphin officials were tested. Those who failed could be demoted, or even demoted to a commoner. All the officials were very nervous before the inspection and tried to avoid any mistakes. And the unsolved case was one of those hiccups that created a lot of problems. It was necessary to quickly find the culprit and convict him so that no one would have any questions about the court and the fairness of the decisions. The city was just preparing for such an inspection, so all officials were on alert. If the deceased traitor really has a relative who is an influential official, then the magistrate may have real problems. They may complain about him for not being able to solve the case. Then the master will face a terrible old age in cold and hunger. He will live out his life as a homeless man and not even have money for a piece of bread. Or even worse, he would just freeze to death somewhere on the street. The magistrate was very afraid of such an old age, so he had to solve the case. While the policemen were chatting in the break room, the chief came in. He came in so quietly that no one noticed. The chief was very angry. He wanted to close the case of the traitor's murder as soon as possible. He demanded efficient work from his subordinates, but the police were also unable to investigate the case. The puzzles did not fit together. The traitor was killed, but he hadn't had any conflicts with anyone the day before. No one wanted him dead, so why the murder took place was a mystery. All the police were able to do was to give the tea chief a drink. They hoped it would calm him down a bit. The chief was angry because the master had scolded him again. He was not just scolding, he was furious. The boss also lost a bar of silver somewhere. The day went to the same place. Shu Qian overheard this conversation. He realized that the piece of silver he had found and picked up unnoticed belonged to a policeman. It was good that no one saw anything, because Qian was not going to give anything back. Suddenly, one of the policemen offered the chief a win-win situation to investigate the case of the traitor's murder. The chief and the policeman whispered about all the details. Shu Qian could not hear much. The only thing he could make out was that the policeman was suggesting that they should do other things. In other words, in local jargon, it meant finding a scapegoat. That is, to lock up a person who has nothing to do with the case. This person's life is simply worthless, so they can be sentenced to death without any remorse. The chief caught the policeman by the arm, which also meant consent in their jargon. Nachalny saw no other way out. The case had been under investigation for too long and had reached a dead end. It was impossible to find the real killer, so the chief ordered Xiao Li to go to the basement and find a homeless person and bring him to the station. The police had already done this several times when they reached a dead end and could not solve the case, but there could not be any hang-ups according to the protocol. All cases had to be closed and the perpetrators punished. Xiao Li did not need to be told twice. He was happy that his boss had approved his plan. Now he and his other colleagues would finally have less work to do. Some homeless person would go to jail for the murder and the case would be closed. Xiao Li ran to fulfill the task. It was much easier to find a homeless person who no one wanted and whose death would not even be known than to investigate a case that he thought had no leads. But Zhu Qian was torn by the injustice. He could not keep quiet, so he burst into the office and shouted that he would not allow this case to be put on hold. We can't let things go on like this. Maybe the police are digging on the wrong side, but the case can be solved. The real murderer could not just evaporate and disappear from the face of the earth. Zhu Qian burst into the room but was immediately twisted by other policemen. Xiao Li told Qian to stay out of the way. He said they were tired of going to the master's carpet. He is literally twisting their balls and demanding that they find the culprit immediately. The magistrate can't wait any longer. He needs results. He needs information that no one else knows. So finding a scapegoat is the best solution. The policeman did not understand what difference it would make to Shen what happens to some homeless person. On the contrary, it would be a plus for him. He will die sooner and be reborn sooner. It will be even better. Maybe after rebirth, this homeless person will have a wonderful life, although everyone knew it was unlikely. But the chief was told that the Chen family had just been released from prison. Perhaps that's why he was so eager for justice. The chief was angry, but he still decided to ask Qian what he would do in his place. Zhu Qian brushed aside the policeman who was still holding his shoulders. He needed his hands free to make a bold statement. Zhu Qian squared his shoulders, extended his hand to the boss, and said that the case should be given to him. Yu Qian hoped for a firm handshake as a sign of the boss's agreement with his proposal. The traitor who was found dead in the street was named Zhang Trui. He was 51 years old. He lived on Kangping Street and walked his big dog every day. Zhang was very rich and, accordingly, influential. Near Changle District, there are 10 hectares of good land, 3 shops selling silk and groceries, and all of this belonged to Zhang Trui. Zhang's first wife died very young, so he married for the second time to a woman 20 years younger than himself. Zhang Trui had no children, except for the only son left by his late wife. The son's name was Zhang Xian. He was 24 years old, and his new wife's name was Yang Zhan, 31 years old. This is all the information that Xu Qian managed to find out about the late merchant. Of course, Qian was most amused by the information about Zhang's young wife. Qian was eating a watermelon and jokingly thinking about how to live life. You have to work half your life and earn money while your future wife is at school. The case file stated, however, that 4 days earlier, Zhang Trudui had gone to the village to collect the rent. He returned home late, around 3 to 5 a.m. That's when the murder took place. Zhang Truvui was found dead in his own yard. At that moment, his wife, who was sleeping in the house, heard screams outside. She looked out the window and saw something terrible. In their own yard, her husband, Zhang Trudi, was lying on the floor. He was lying in a pool of blood, face down. His eyes were full of hatred and fear. It was obvious that Zhang Trudi had seen his attacker before he died, and perhaps even recognized him. But the attacker was stronger, because he killed the merchant with a single blow. There were no signs of a struggle, nor did the deceased's wife make any sounds of confrontation. Someone hit him hard on the head. The blow was fatal. There was no chance to save Zhang. The woman was naturally very scared and did not know what to do. But she managed to notice a dark figure climbing over the wall of their yard. Zhuan asked if there was a testimony from the night watchman. The watchman didn't see anything suspicious that night. Julian did not see the main information in the report, how much silver was stolen, so he asked the police about it. Police officer Xiao Li initially wanted to name the amount, but stopped himself. He said that the deceased had just returned from collecting taxes. Therefore, Qian can imagine how much it was. Julian thought about it. How could a murderer and a thief in one person escape with a large box of money without anyone noticing him? After all, there are always guards walking around the city at night. The guards patrol all the streets, looking into every corner. But the most important thing is that there are a lot of guards. It is a very difficult task to get past them unnoticed, to do it quickly, and to carry a huge box of riches. Xian realized that this was the first clue. If he were a thief, he would have come the day after the tax collection. Zhu Xian drank his tea and tried to concentrate. He needed to go over all the information he had gathered in his head again. Suddenly, the boss walked into the room and knocked Qian out of his thoughts. The boss wanted to know immediately how the investigation was going. Perhaps Qian had already found the killer. Qian laughed. The police had been investigating the case for 4 days, and he was expected to have a result in a matter of hours. Qian smiled and told his boss that he hadn't got everything yet. But he has some clues. The case file says that footprints were found on the wall of Zhang's house. It means that the burglar jumped over it, just like his wife said. The boss was drinking tea and did not understand what Qian was getting at. Where was the clue and what was the problem? Yuan realized that there would be no dialogue, because the boss seemed unable to relate basic things. So he asked why there were marks on the wall. The boss got nervous. The question seemed stupid to him. For him, everything was logical. The marks on the wall were left because of the mud on the soles of his shoes. Then Qian asked the next question. Where did the dirt on the shoes come from if Zhang's house was next to a flower garden? And why were the footprints only on the wall? Why were there no footprints in the yard? Other police officers joined the discussion. They expressed their assumptions. Perhaps when the thief entered the yard, he noticed his footprints and erased them. But running away after the murder, there was no way to erase the traces, so a few remained on the wall. Chan agreed that this version is also possible. But it has many buts. There would have to be traces of penetration in the garden itself. The wall from which the thief jumped in April is very high. A good dent should have been left in the flower garden, unless the thief was very small and light and did not leave a trace of landing. For Qian, it was still a mystery why the thief was pushing off the wall when he was running away. The next question prompted some thought from the boss. He seems to be beginning to dig in and understand the truth. Jean clarified whether the victim was really killed by a blunt object hitting the gasket. The chief confirmed this information. Zhuan wondered why he should stun the victim when killing him. In this case, it is better to use a knife, so that the blade would pierce and death would surely ensue. Hitting with a blunt object was too risky. A thief would never take such a risk going into a business without a knife in his pocket. He never knows if something more serious will happen in a dangerous situation when he has to save his own life. And it was necessary to hit with a blunt object very hard. That is, the attacker had to be bigger and stronger than Zhang Tvorui. Then one of the police officers guessed that perhaps the murder was not part of the plan. Perhaps the thief hoped that Zhang Trudy was tired and had been sleeping for a long time, and the box of money could be simply picked up and carried away, so no one would even notice. The chief had an epiphany. He continued the policeman's thought that perhaps the murder was an accident. It was only a robbery that was planned, so the thief did not bring a knife. But the blunt force trauma was so severe that Zhang died immediately. The chief was so pleased with his investigation that he stood up from his desk. The boss wanted to hear more of Chang's opinion, so he decided to ask him why he had to stun the official. Shukan agreed that this was only possible if the killer did not have a weapon at hand. The boss was silent for a minute. He was digesting all the information. Ziyan saved the most interesting part for last. He was quiet for a few minutes, and then returned to the last paragraph in the murder report. The victim's wife suddenly fainted. After examination, the doctor concluded that she was pregnant. Zhu Qian emphasized this point very clearly and emphatically, but no one seemed to understand what Zhu Qian was getting at. The police officers, on the contrary, almost burst into tears, feeling sorry for Zhang's wife. The child will be left without a father before it is born. Qian wanted to shut these clumsy policemen up. He did not understand how they could be so stupid. Qian had to chew on all the details again. He gathered his emotions into a fist and continued. Zhang's wife was much younger than him. They had been married for 10 years. Why then did she get pregnant only now? Qian continued that after 10 years together, it is impossible to have a child with a young, healthy wife. This is only possible if the couple specifically did not want children, or if one of the partners had health problems. When the boss heard about these guesses, he could not stand on his feet. He was shocked, but Qian was not going to stop, so he asked the most important question that no one would have dared to even think about, let alone say. Perhaps this child was not from a legitimate husband. The boss was furious. He did not understand what Qian was getting at. While everyone was shocked and angry, Qian calmly poured himself some tea. He knew he was right and was able to reveal this right very quickly. When the cup was full, Qian continued his monologue. Jungin said it was not just a theft. It was a planned murder. Everyone was shocked by what they heard. Jungin decided to tell his version of what really happened and why the merchant Zhang Tongyi died. His wife was a beautiful and young woman. She wanted comfort and affection, so she cheated on Zhang with someone from the outside. Or rather, she slept with his stepson, a young man with a beautiful body and a stupid head. He was also not averse to love affairs. On the day of his death, his wife and son knew that Zhang was going to collect tribute. They said goodbye to him as usual. The wife and son knew their father's schedule, when he would return and where he would put the money. But this time Zhang Truve returned earlier, and caught the lovers red-handed, just in the midst of the betrayal itself. Zheng Terui was very angry. He wanted to kill them both. First, he wanted to strangle his wife and then kill his son, but strength and youth prevailed. While Zhang was dealing with his wife, his son hit him on the back of the head with some blunt object. For example, a pitcher from which the lovers used to pour wine, or a vase that used to hold flowers. But not a knife, because it is clear that the son never carried a knife in his pocket. He had to use some means at hand. The son did not want to kill his father. He just had no choice at the time, so he struck. But he didn't calculate the strength. The blow was fatal because the boy was bigger and taller than his father. It was not possible to save Zhang Trudy. They had to save their own skins somehow. Then the son invented another story, allegedly about a robbery, and falsified the crime scene. He took the body to the yard, and he left footprints on the wall. He did everything so that at first glance it would seem that it was an ordinary theft. For Zhu, the story was obvious, and the fact that the lover was Zhang Tongyi's son was also obvious. If the lover was someone from the outside, he would not have been able to stage it all. First of all, he would have had to wait for a moment when there was no patrol nearby, and no one would have noticed anything. And this is almost impossible to do. Just as it is impossible to take out a chest of silver and disappear like an invisible man. The police officers and the chief listened to this detailed description of the crime and could not believe what they were hearing. The case was so confusing. But what about their version of the robbery? Couldn't it have been just a robbery? Zhu Qian calmly drank his tea and argued why it couldn't have been a simple robbery. The thief would never have gone for the money on the night of the collection. He would have waited until the silver was exchanged for securities and stolen them. It was much easier. This way, the robbery could really go unnoticed by the guards patrolling the streets, because it's one thing to see a person walking down the street with a box of silver, and another thing to see a person who just hid securities behind his or her back. No one will just inspect a passerby. In other words, a young wife left alone with a child under her heart is not true. Finishing his tea, Qian said that it was a fiction to throw the police off their guard, and if it wasn't for him, the criminals would have succeeded. The police were shocked that Qian had investigated the case so quickly. Could he really understand everything just by reading the report? Qian knew he was right, but in order not to look too perfect in front of his colleagues, especially his superior, he said that it was just his guess, and this version still needed to be verified. Duckley pondered every word Chen said, but he wondered why Chen thought that the lover was the son of the murdered man. Zhu Qian put the empty cup of tea next to him, put both hands to his chin, and pointed out two important facts. First, the son lived with his father and his young wife. On the night of the crime, he claimed that he was reading a book in the house. His wife said that she was woken up by a scream, but the son, who was awake at the time, did not hear any sounds. It is unlikely that the person who saw the thief made a single sound. On the contrary, the screams should have been heard all along the street. The guards themselves, including their own son, should have heard Zhang Tongyi. But it turns out that the son did not care that his father was attacked and might die. Secondly, there are no signs of forced entry. The flower bed is intact, although the robber landed there. There are only traces on the wall, so it turns out that there was no break-in. That's why the puzzle is complete. There was no one else in the house except his wife and son. The boss finally realized that the mark was left on the wall to confuse them. The boss was sweating when he came to this conclusion. Zhu Qian praised the chief for his reasonable conclusion. He advised him to compare the mark on the wall with the shoe print of the victim's son. The chief agreed that they would get a complete match, and then that was it. The case was solved. Zhu Yan once again praised the boss, although his work here was, but the boss at least understood everything quickly and drew the right conclusion. The Chani was proud of himself. He was finally able to solve the case. No more accusations that the case was being dragged out and he was a mediocre. Now the chief would receive praise and all the honors. The very next day, Yang Zhang's wife and son, Xian Zhang, were summoned to the magistrate's carpet. Both were on their knees and did not know why they were summoned and what was going to happen. Deng Jing was very worried. She was afraid to look up, She was holding the handkerchief so tightly in her hands that she was afraid that if it fell, she would faint as well. Xinjiang, on the other hand, was very self-confident. His gaze was even a little aggressive. Both of them knelt before Ren Wuzhu. He tapped the table with his hand to get their attention. Renju decided to start with the trump cards, so he asked directly why they had killed Zhang. Renaz decided to scare them with his strength and aggression. He clenched his teeth and bulged his eyes so hard that it looked like he was going to burst with anger. But Xiangzhang's son did not fall for this provocation. He said that he did not understand what was being said. How can a son kill his own father? Reiju squinted his eyes. He could see that Xiang was hiding something. A few minutes earlier, the police chief burst into the magistrate's office. He said that he had new details about the case and asked for an arrest warrant. The chief was in such a hurry that he was out of breath. The boss was very uncomfortable telling him about all the details of the case. He was afraid that the master would not believe him. And so it happened. The magistrate attacked the chief and called him an incompetent pervert. The master did not understand why he should believe such nonsense. The boss was very worried. Sweat was rolling down his face. But he pulled himself together and made the master listen to all the details and give him the order. When the magistrate found out that Xu Qian had helped solve the case, he immediately believed it and issued all the necessary orders and documents. Zhu Qian was watching the situation from behind the door. He was a real detective. The interrogation of Zhang's wife and son continued. The magistrate interrogated the two at the same time. First, he asked his son where he was when the murder took place. Zhenjiang replied that he was in his room. The interrogation continued. The magistrate asked what he was doing. Xiang replied that he was reading a book. The magistrate asked if anyone could confirm that Xiangzhang was really in his room. Did he have any witnesses? Xian laughed. Like what witnesses could there be at night? Then the master turned to Yangzhang. He was also not particularly ceremonious, and asked directly why the lady got pregnant after 10 years of marriage. Maybe she was cheating with her stepson. What the master said shocked everyone present, especially Yangzhang and Xianzhang. They both stared, opened their mouths, and could not say a word. Finally, Yangzhang came to her senses. She realized that she had to say something, so she said that she had health problems and had only recently been able to cure them. The woman accused the magistrate of suspecting her pregnant of murdering her husband. This was unacceptable. Behind the door, Xu Qian listened attentively to the interrogation process. He was furious at the master's incompetence. How could he interrogate the two of them at the same time? But the magistrate kept asking stupid questions. He asked if the woman was sure that she had seen a dark figure climbing over the wall in the garden. Jian nodded her head in approval, but the master was only irritated by this answer. He asked her why there were no signs of forced entry during the search of the garden. Yan didn't know what she was supposed to say. Yanjian decided to defend himself for his wife. He knew that the best defense was offense, so he shouted after the magistrate's questions about why no one had even tried to find evidence of the break-in. Instead, they suspected him and his mother of death. The fact that Xiang called Yang Mama shocked her even more than the master's questions and accusations. Xu Kong was having fun watching the master's attacks. It could end up being very interesting. That's exactly what happened, with the sharp-tongued minister ordering Xiangzhang to be removed from the hall immediately. But Jian did not stop. As two bodyguards dragged him out of the room, he shouted out whether the minister was afraid of impeachment. The minister was stumped by the question. For the first time, he did not know what to say. The masters had a certain list of responsibilities. They had to keep order in the district, and to punish those who are guilty. But if they exceeded their authority, a complaint could be filed against them. But the minister felt the power in his hands. Therefore, for such pogroms, he ordered Xiangzhang to be caned 20 times. Zhu Qian realized that if the interrogation continued in this way, the culprit would never be found. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. Through the guard, Qian handed a note to Minister Zhu. The guard didn't even notice that Qian was in the room. He asked what he was doing here, but Xu Qian just smiled and said that the trial should be suspended. He had a great idea. Yakzhang sat alone in the interrogation room. The room was large and dark, with only a small window letting in light. Yang was sitting at a wide wooden table. There was another chair opposite, so it was clear that someone else was about to enter the room. Yang did not understand why she was being held here, why the court was stopped, and where Xianzhang was taken. The only thing that remained unchanged was that Yang did not let go of her handkerchief. Suddenly the door to the room opened. Juqian entered the room. He was holding a tray with tea and 2 cups and looked very friendly. Chen closed the door behind him so that no one would interfere with them. He smiled at Yang and told her not to worry. He only came to talk. Drian began to worry. A few minutes ago, she was being yelled at and asked awkward questions. And now some guy is smiling and offering her tea. Qian took his hat off his head. This made him look even more friendly. He introduced himself and said that Yang could call him Sir Shu. Jung asked him again what his name was. Shu's name was very familiar to her, but she couldn't remember where she knew it from. They both sat down at the table. Shu offered the woman some tea, but he did not wait for her to accept or refuse, and immediately poured it into a cup. Yumeng looked at her reflection in the cup of tea. She was pale and very worried. Jan did not know what they wanted from her. She was tired and just wanted to rest. Yang stared at Sir Shu and waited for him to start talking. She didn't know why he was sitting there. Qian began his interrogation from afar. He was a good judge of women, so he first complimented Yang. He said she had very nice jewelry. It was obvious that her husband cared about her and gave her a lot of jewelry. Then Shu decided to be unceremonious and asked why it took Yang so long to get pregnant. Perhaps her late husband had health problems. Jan wanted to be pitied, so she shed 1 tear, which she quickly wiped away with her handkerchief. She admitted that she was the one with the problem. They had been trying to conceive for a long time, and when they finally succeeded, her husband died. Yang wanted to cry even harder to make Shu feel sympathetic, but she failed. 1 stingy tear was all she could manage. Zhu listened attentively and saw that Yang was glad that she and her late husband had no children together, but she hid it well. Shu asked if the fact that Yang had health problems upset her husband, and if he went to brothels to relieve his grief. Jian took a cup of tea and took the first sip. The tea was delicious. The woman answered Shu's questions very cautiously. She agreed that her husband had visited brothels, but she doesn't see anything wrong with that. All men go there. This is where Chen caught his first clue. He was glad that the woman didn't think what she was saying. Their family made him feel sick. Her husband, with money, wanders around brothels, and she herself has a child in her belly from her husband's son. It was a shame. Qian finished his tea and put the cup on the table. He said he understood the woman. Her husband had neglected her interests and favored prostitutes. It was a great excuse to cheat on him, too. Jan's stomach began to hurt from what she heard. She didn't understand how this guy knew everything. Shuakshu continued. He leaned 1 hand on the table and said that he understood why Yang betrayed her husband, but he did not understand why she killed him. This question freaked Jan out. She was so nervous that she even dropped the tea. The cup fell on the table and all the tea spilled on the floor. Jan rarely got up from the table. She didn't want to continue the conversation, and her stomach began to hurt even more. The woman clutched her stomach and asked rudely what Shu was talking about, but Qian continued his interrogation. He was not interested in what Yang thought about it. He asked her how many years her younger son, Zhang Xian, was. If Qian counted well, it was 7 years. Ying was very angry. Her eyes were filled with hatred. She did not like Sir Shu very much, and this conversation was exhausting her. She asked once again what Sir Shu wanted from her, and what he meant by asking these incomprehensible questions. Sir Shu sat still. He was so pleased that he had solved the case and that his interrogation was going so well. So, with such a satisfied expression on his face, he told Yang that she was just an eagle eating little chickens. It was a metaphor, but it was a very apt one. Jan pretended not to understand what he was getting at. What eagle and what kind of birds? So Shu Qian decided to put all his cards on the table, and he told everything in a way that was as clear as possible even for Yang. He told what happened that evening when the traitor was killed. His wife Yang Zhang was alone at home. She was very lonely, so she decided to seduce her stepson. Jan listened intently and could not believe how he knew the whole truth. She wanted this secret to die with her. Zhu continued, "The man is traveling on business. Yang and Xian Zhang spend the night together, but suddenly, Creator returns faster and catches them red-handed. A fight breaks out, and the woman beats the man to death with a vase. To cover up the crime, they drag the body to the yard and invent a legend about the thief. Zhang Xian puts a shoe print on the wall as proof that it was a thief. Yang listened to everything Xu Qian said and did not understand how anyone could have discovered their brilliant plan. Only now her eyes were full of tears. Yang Zhen leaned her hands on the table, unable to stand. She screamed that she did not kill her husband. She was framed. Her hands were shaking. Xu Tian realized that the woman was very nervous and that everything he had said was true. But Xu wanted to hear the whole story from Yang herself. He needed direct testimony, so he had to bring her out for a frank conversation where she would testify. Xu asked if the woman was surprised by how he knew all this. Jan could barely hold back her tears. Had she been abandoned and was she all alone in this world? Then Xu Tian said what Yang was so afraid to hear, that Zhang Xian had already confessed to everything. Yang did not want to believe it. It was impossible. She had been betrayed. Xu Tian wanted to press Yang. He wanted to hear her confess from the bottom of her heart, so he reiterated that her lover had already confessed everything. But Xu had thought of everything himself, because they had missed a lot of things when they staged the robbery. Yineng could barely stand up. She wanted to forget everything and just rest, but she wondered how Xu had figured it all out. Yu said that at first Zhang Xian left traces on the wall, but not in the garden. If a thief could jump over the wall, he would not leave a trace. Secondly, Zhang was killed with a blunt object, and if it had been done by a thief, he would have used a knife. Thieves always carry a knife to defend themselves in case of emergency. Anyone who breaks into someone else's house will be punished by being caned 80 times. Also, if the owner of the house kills the thief, he will not be imprisoned. Therefore, to stay alive, thieves always carry a knife because a blunt object is not always available. Finally, Xu named the main argument in favor of her being a murderer. Jian stood there and mentally said goodbye to her life. The case is solved. She will go to jail. Her life no longer has any meaning. Yu said the most important mistake was that the body of the deceased was lying with its feet facing the front gate. This means that the victim was attacked from the garden. In Xu's opinion, this would be stupid. But this can be easily explained by the fact that the body was dragged out of the house and simply forgotten to be turned around. Yakzhang did not know what to say. She had no energy for anything. She just fell on a chair from exhaustion. The woman was very smart, but she missed so many things. She did not understand why she was so inattentive. Jan could not say a single word. Zhu Qian also noticed that the woman had nothing to add, just like Zhang Xian. So he also confessed everything. Qin was still waiting for a heartfelt confession of all the details, so he decided to lie a little. He claimed that Xiang Zhang told him that it was Yang Zhan who killed his father, and that this woman had forced him into intimacy, and he did not want any relationship with her. But Yang threatened him with the child she conceived. Xian Zhang allegedly confessed that it was Yang who killed Foroi that evening during a quarrel. How she screamed that it wasn't her, that in fact it was exactly the opposite. Zhu also said that Zhang Xian, having confessed to everything, understood the gravity of the situation. Therefore he suggested that the magistrate take 500,000 silver pieces and shift the blame for the murder to Yang Zhang alone. Zhang Xian had already brought the required amount and handed it over to the magistrate. Yang Zhang could not stand on her feet and fell down. After hearing what she had heard, her body was shackled with hatred and fatigue. It did not obey her at all. Zhu Xian did not rush to help the woman. He just watched her behavior just as intently. Yang Zhang was lying on the floor and could not get up. Her eyes were full of tears and her life had lost all meaning. Xu Qian walked closer to Yang Zheng, who was still lying motionless on the floor. He looked her straight in the eye. He said that he didn't know what her stepson was really like, but he didn't think he loved Yan at all. Their relationship was based only on passion without any hint of love. Yang Zhang realized that this was the case. No one really needed her and her unborn child. Finally, the veil fell from Yang Zhang's eyes and she realized that Zhang Xian was just a young son of rich parents, spoiled by fate. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and she didn't even want to talk about the inheritance. With such inclinations, these guys want nothing but a carefree life. Why did such a young and wealthy guy need a woman? Zhu Yan decided to bribe Yang by saying that the magistrate was wise and fair. Therefore, despite Yazan Xian's testimony, they ordered Yang herself to be interrogated. Qian promised that if the woman wrote a sincere confession, the magistrate would pardon her from the death penalty. It seems that this was Yang Zhang's only chance for life. It was the last ray of sunshine in this whole story. Jan was crying and screaming in her head. Despite everything, she was young and just wanted to live. So she asked Qian again if she could be pardoned. Yuan's peculiarity was his stony face and eyes that never betrayed true emotions. He knew he was brazenly lying to this woman just to get her to confess, but he told her a lie to her face. He gave her the last hope of life and pardon. Yang Zhang wrote a heartfelt confession and described in detail how the murder took place. She still hoped for a pardon, but according to Dafen's laws, treason and premeditated murder are punishable by beheading in public, and the death penalty is not subject to appeal. All this time, while Yang Zhang was being interrogated, her stepson was locked in an empty room. He did not know what was happening in court, why the trial was taking so long, and what Yang had said. He wanted to believe that she was a wise woman and would not say anything unnecessary. But a guard came into Xiang's room and showed him Yang's heartfelt confession. Then all hopes collapsed at once. Xian just slid down the wall and sat on the floor. He was already saying goodbye to his life in his mind. The master read Yang Zhang's heartfelt confession in detail. He carefully read every line and replayed it in his head. Even though the master did not believe that people could be such heartless bastards, each line made him hate them even more. As he read, he realized what kind of bastards these two were, that they could do something so immoral. After finishing reading the heartfelt confession, the master decided that he should praise Xu Qian. After all, he really did a great job. In such a short time, he had done a 100% job. He alone did what an entire police department could not do. Qian was cunning. He needed not only recognition but also close ties, so he bowed his head in deference to the minister and said that it was all thanks to him. After all, Qian is just a student who uses knowledge on the way to perfection. The boss listened to Qian's intelligent speech. He knows how to please the minister, how to earn points in front of him. Even the boss does not always manage to find the right words. The chief recalled that when Xu Qian first appeared in their department, he was a simple boy, simple-minded and stubborn. But now Czar's Qian is smart and knows how to find a way to benefit himself. Zhu Qian was proud of himself. He always told himself that he had to believe in himself. He didn't care about anyone's opinion. He thought only with his own head. He was a real hothead. The boss stood behind him and wondered how Qian was able to solve the case so quickly, literally in a few hours. But no one had time to think about it. They had to get back to the station and start another uninteresting job. On the way to the police station, the chief caught up with Qian, hugged him tightly around the neck and congratulated him on his successful solving of the case. This case had to be celebrated somehow, so he decided to take him to Gulan Tower to have some fun. The policeman laughed that Qian would finally lose his virginity. Their little bird would finally grow up and become a real man. Qian was even embarrassed by this proposal. He was also embarrassed that no one had asked him what he really wanted, and no one said at whose expense the celebration would be. Qian had more questions than answers. So Xu Qian made a stony face and decided to refuse. He said that he was not the kind of man to walk around brothels. Qian thought that if he followed the whims of his body, he would not be able to reach the level of qi training. But in this world, even with brothels, things were not easy. because the Gulan was a brothel for ordinary workers. But there was also Qinglo, an elite home for high-ranking officials. All his life, Qian thought it was just an expensive spa, but it turned out that it provided a much wider and more pleasant range of services. But the most prestigious brothel in Dafeng was Jiao Fanxi. The girls in Jiao Fanxi were incredibly beautiful. They were all daughters of officials who had somehow broken the law. Therefore, their daughters had no money and no choice but to go to work in Jiao Fanxi. But despite this, the girls were well-groomed and had delicate skin. The chief spoke of these girls as goddesses. He recalled that at the beginning of the year, he was lucky enough to go there with the district judge. And there the chief met her, Fu Xiang. She was the most beautiful woman the chief had ever met. Fu Qian listened to these details and was embarrassed. He didn't understand why he needed to know all these details of his boss's sex life. The other police officers listened to the chief's stories like a fairy tale. They quietly sipped their vodka and savored all the details of the chief's trip to the brothel. One of the policemen wanted to hear more interesting facts, so he asked the chief if he had a good time with Fu Xiang. But the chief did not stop describing her beauty and talent. But the boss didn't get to spend time with her because she was busy with another customer. Qian decided to ask how much it costs to spend one night like this. When it came to money, the boss finally stopped describing the girl's beauty, and he named the amount of 30 liang. It was cosmically expensive. The peanut-chewing policemen even seemed to have lost their appetite. None of them could afford even one night like that in their entire lives. Police officers did not earn that much, so it was a mystery how much money their boss had. Qian laughed. It seemed to him that he had to be pretty drunk to give that kind of money for a night with a prostitute. So he laughed and offered his boss some peanuts. Maybe he drinks a lot but doesn't eat snacks, so he doesn't spend that kind of money without thinking. For 30 liang, you could buy 2 nice houses, not just a night with a prostitute. Moreover, a night with a prostitute did not mean a whole night of unbridled passion. Not every boss would be able to withstand a whole night of love, so sometimes they just played mahjong with prostitutes, talked, drank tea, or something else. Julian loved money and loved spending it, but he thought he would never spend money on such a stupid thing. You had to be completely out of your mind to give away a fortune for a night with a prostitute. Zhu continued to live near his uncle and aunt's house. He had a small room and it was enough for him. Qian did not have a family and had not yet dreamed of one. He was neither financially nor mentally ready for a family. Zhu Qian sat down at his desk and started counting what day it was, according to different Chinese calendars. But then he got confused and decided not to get smart, because the calendar said October 18th. Zhu decided to start a diary, to write down everything that happens in his life. This way, he planned to change his lifestyle and develop new healthy habits. He didn't have much to do. Qian had a lot of free time. Qian, who had always wanted recognition, now wondered if he really needed it in this city. Now it seemed to Xu Qian that it was not a good idea to become a high-ranking official, because such officials were often robbed and killed. Corruption reigned supreme in the city. Everything was solved with money, and often that money was what led to death. The best life was to be a middle-class person. Such people lived richer than anyone else, but they never got into a battle for a title. They were often forgiven for mistakes in their work. This layer of society was considered the most stable. Qian was also lucky. Today at the market, he again noticed a zhen on the ground and picked it up. Qian wrote all this down in his diary. He made an entry in his diary almost every day. Zhu Qian planned to resign from the police. He didn't want to work there anymore because they paid him very little. Police officers received 2 liang and a bag of rice a month. Xu dreamed of making money in gold, because gold was much more valuable in this world than silver. Although traders and businessmen rarely dealt with gold. But Xu felt that this currency was the future, and Xu Qian's instincts were always on top of their game, and never let him down. After hearing his boss talk about Jiao Fanxi forever, Qian also dreamed of going there. But with a policeman's salary, he would never be able to get there. So Qian thought about where he could get more money. In the evening, Chen decided to resign from the police, but in the morning he changed his mind. He decided not to rush into this decision. He would always have time to resign. The only thing that surprised Chen was corruption. It was everywhere, and in the police, Chen could fight it at least a little. But not all cases were solved because corruption was beneficial to everyone, including some police officers and magistrates. Money ruled this world. Zhu Yu's luck did not leave him. He found another Zhen in Yamen. October 23rd was supposed to be Shu Qian's happiest day, because on that day, his boss promised to take him to Gulan. As it turned out, Qian was a bit mistaken about this place. There was a lot of beauty and even creativity hidden behind these walls. But it is clear that everyone left there with empty wallets. Folk music could be heard there. Qian sat there and was mesmerized by the incredible melody and the girls' ability to play their instruments. He had never heard such good songs and such pure playing before. However, the music was often mixed with the moans of clients in the other room. Qian found it very distracting, but at that moment, he dreamed of making a lot of money as soon as possible, and being in the place of the man in the next room having fun with a prostitute. Qian was lucky even in brothels. Even there he found another Zhen. It sparkled across the room. Qian did not understand how no one had seen it before. On October 22nd, Qian was in Gulan again. But this time he was not just listening to music, he was drinking tea with prostitutes. The tea there was also the most oily in the world. Shu thought that everything in this place was beautiful, from the tea to the girls. On October 23rd, Qian was in the same Gulan again. He drank tea again and joked a lot. He really liked this place. Shu dreamed of coming here every day, but he didn't have enough money to do so. Therefore, the question of how to earn a lot of money always bothered him. On October 24th, Yan was in Gulan again. This time, he met his boss there. The boss asked why Yan was so happy. But how could he be if he found himself in such a beautiful place every day? On October 27th, Qian ran out of money. They had to pay with the last of their money. The girls didn't like it either. They also enjoyed Shu Qian's company, but they had never worked on a charitable basis and had no plans to. So they were happy to wait for Shu when his pockets were full of money. After spending his entire fortune in a few days, Qian promised himself that he would never return to Gulan again. Zhu Xian was thinking of ways to make more money. Alchemy came to mind. Of course, he would have to learn a lot more, but Zhu was ready to do it as long as it brought in money. It occurred to Chen to make glass. For a second, he thought that there were ancient people who had never seen glass, and for them it would be a real invention, something fantastic and extraordinary, perhaps even something magical, and something that only masters of alchemy could do. But then Shu pulled out a bowl of water from his pocket that everyone carried with them. He realized that glass already existed, that it had been invented long ago. Shu was very disappointed. Shu also found his uncle's stash of money. His uncle had buried the stash in the garden near the flower bed, and then he spent a long time digging it up because he knew the money was there somewhere. Shu laughed for a long time when he saw his uncle working in the garden. He knew that the money was long gone. He had taken it and spent it all. But of course, he didn't tell his uncle because he would have killed him. Despite his promise to never return to Gulan again, on October 30th, Qian went there again. He and his boss and the prostitutes had a good time and laughed. Zhu Qian never stopped coming up with brilliant ideas on how to make more money. On October 31st, he came up with another way to make money, creating paper. After all, everything ingenious is as simple as possible, and paper is what people need every day. Letters, reports, love messages, all of these are written on paper, so you just need to make it and sell it in unmeasured quantities. Zhu dreamed of opening his own factory. He thought that after that, money would flow like a river. He hadn't earned anything yet, but he was already dreaming of eating the best food and sleeping with the most beautiful geishas. He just had to start. However, the process of creating the paper was very energy-intensive, so Qian quickly crossed this dream out of his diary. Shu wanted a lot of money, but he didn't want to work hard. He dreamed of making money out of thin air, out of nothing. That would be the perfect option for him. Instead, Qian wrote in his diary that he had found another zhen in the market today. He was surprised that he often found money on the ground so often. On November 3rd, Qian spent all the money he found in his uncle's stash. He had to think about where to get money again. Borrowing from his uncle was not an option. He was left naked and barefoot. And he did not want to borrow from Sinian, because his cousin had just made fun of him for being broke. As a result, Qian had only 5 of the previously found zhens left, and he had no more money. While Qian thought about where to get more money, Xinyan was walking around the house muttering something. No one could make out what Xinyan was whispering to himself, but he was constantly thinking, writing something down, wiping something off. And when Xinyan saw that Qian was trying to spy on him, he simply ran away. He wanted peace and quiet, not the company of his annoying cousin. The brothers had never been on friendly terms. Xinyan did not like Xu because he spent too much time with his father. Xinyan also wanted to be special to his father, but they had no common interests. Xinyan's father was a warrior and he was a scientist. That's how their paths diverged. Yingyan tried to stop him poetically. With his hand on his heart, he shouted in the wake of where he was running away. Xu Qian sometimes dreamed of making friends with his brother, but these attempts always ended in mockery of each other. They did not know how to communicate without offending each other. On November 5th, Qian and his colleagues went to a tea house to listen to Mr. Shu's tales and legends. While listening to these stories, Shu came up with another brilliant idea on how to make more money. He decided that he would listen to these martial arts novels, rewrite them, and publish them. Shu thought that publishing was very easy and simple. He wrote once, copied it, and made his profit without having to work hard. Gold coins shone in Shu's eyes. This idea seemed perfect to him. In his dreams of how he would make a lot of money publishing books, Shu found another zhen. This was a sign that it was time to visit Gulan. Once he got to work on writing the book, Shu's dreams were shattered by reality. On November 7th, he realized that he was a naive idiot. Mr. Shu's novels have from 12 to 1,000,000 words. If you rewrite everything with a brush, you can go crazy, and your hands will simply fall off from overwork. Of course, you can also carve a pencil out of charcoal. Then it will be easier to write. But when Shu started writing, he forgot what the novel was about. And although Shu's imagination was always on top, it was not acceptable to invent his own. That's why he didn't earn anything in 9 days. It was November 8th on the calendar. It was raining outside. It was damp and cold. It was the same in Qian's heart. He was still thinking about where he could get money. He was not a stupid boy at all, but he knew a little bit of everything and did not understand how to make money, what knowledge to improve. Maybe he should go to school somewhere. But Zhu realized that the education system was useless. It is only focused on passing exams, not on real knowledge that can bring good money. Today, Qian talked to his uncle, and during the conversation, he realized that this world is much different than he had imagined. The world is ruled by corruption. It is everywhere, in every sphere. Zhu often met officials in Gulan. They spent a lot of money there, but all this money was not earned honestly. That is why it was so easily spent in such establishments. Because a person who works hard will definitely think several times about where to spend money and will not throw it around. It was impossible to meet an honest official in Gulan. It was November 9th on the calendar. Shu Qian sat by the window and dreamed. Suddenly, for some reason, he was reminded of Kaveh, the alchemist girl. Qian recalled her image in detail and how he had shown her an experiment in making the legendary silver. She had watched the process with such enthusiasm and asked for details so obsessively. Did this girl manage to reproduce this experiment on her own? Otherwise, why hadn't she found Shu and come to him for this knowledge? Of course, Qian was a bad teacher, but he was willing to work with Kavi. At some point, Qian wanted something trivial, just love. He wanted someone he could rely on, someone he could fall in love with, and someone who would love him despite his flaws. They would live happily together in this cruel and indifferent society. And then he would not need to go to Gulan, because he would feel love and comfort at home. Tian was bursting with romance. His soul soared high into the sky. He even wanted to sing because of these feelings of Shu's and sang some snotty romantic song. But this singing was more like a kind of grumbling. It was good that no one heard him. Because Shu had a terrible voice, frankly. Perhaps that's why he liked it so much in Gulan, because they sang fantastically, like angels. November 10th. Shu Tian was drinking tea with his cousins. At first, Shu was silent, but he kept thinking about how to make a lot of money. The idea of publishing a novel seemed to him the most successful. So Shu constantly scolded himself for forgetting so many details from the novel. He decided that if he read the novel out loud, his memory would come back, and all the forgotten details would be recalled. So the tea party with his sisters was very appropriate. Shu decided that they would be the first listeners and tried to retell the story to them. Of course, the story was not perfect. Shu missed many important moments, but Ling Ye's older sister liked it so much that she almost burst into tears, although Ling Ye was very emotional and could cry at any little thing. Shu was still very pleased that his words could move the girls so much. Her eyes were wet. This was the reaction Shu expected from his story, but Lin Yi's little sister didn't even shed a tear. As always, she was only interested in food, so she interrupted Shu from time to time and asked him to buy more delicious buns. Lin Yi was always hungry, and when she was hungry, nothing made her happy. Because little Lin Yi was constantly distracting Shu, he was very angry and irritated. So he gave her a preventive slap. It seemed to Shu that at this age, it was already possible to be more restrained and understand that food could wait. There is something more important to talk about now. But after receiving the slap, Lin Yi burst into tears so that she could be heard in the neighboring street. This irritated Shu even more. November 11th. Shu Qian met writer Li Dianxi by chance and invited him to tea. He didn't tell him that he wanted to become a publisher, rewrite and publish a novel. Shu had already realized that his memory was not good, so he asked Li Dianxi to tell him a new story. Li Dianxi told him about the princess of King Zhengbei. She was considered to be the most beautiful girl in the entire dynasty. But Li Dianxi could not describe her beauty in detail because he had never seen her in person. As a writer, he used a lot of metaphors and analogies, but many of these words were new to Shu. He needed to hear this story in human terms, in simple language. Jin decided to ask his uncle about this princess. His uncle's throat went dry when he mentioned the princess of King Zhengbei. He had seen her and wanted to describe her in as much detail as possible. But his uncle did not have a rich vocabulary, so he described her beauty to the best of his boring vocabulary. From this story, Shu only remembered that the princess was divine and beautiful. But even such a short description made Shu's heart become voraciously interested in this girl. Shu really wanted to fall in love. He was ready for it. But his chosen one had to be the best and most beautiful. In his mind, Shu could even imagine King Zhengbei's princess by his side. He had never seen her, and the probability of seeing her was 0. Shu continued to keep his diary and record every day he lived. On November 12th, Shu felt very depressed. He still hadn't become rich. He felt like a walking disgrace to himself and to the country. Qian did not even want to be seen by anyone. He was so unpleasant to himself. On November 13th, Shu received his paycheck and became a little more lively. But he did not think about how to spend the money he earned for a long time. He went to Gulan again, where he drank tea and had fun with the girls as usual. After all this fun, Shu had a wonderful day. The sun was shining, birds were flying, and his mood was high. Sunny weather always had a good effect on Shu. It was as if it was his energy boost. On his way home, Shu saw a shooting range in a tree. Children were probably having fun and throwing knives. Shu decided to try his hand at it, even though he had never thrown a knife at a target before. But trying something new was always very interesting. Shu threw the knives at random. He never aimed on purpose, but all 4 stabs were in the top 10 at the same target. Yu Xian was very surprised. He knew that beginners were always lucky, but not this lucky. It was something incredible. Shu realized that something was happening to his body, some kind of devil. He was always incredibly lucky, The moment seemed trivial, but in every conflict he always gets away with it. And he always knows how to find the right words, and he often meets the right people on his way. And these acquaintances are very useful later. You recalled how he lived that month and how many moments of luck he had. For example, he was always finding silver. In this month alone, he accidentally collected a pile of silver. It was about half of his monthly salary. No one else could boast of that. Shu was always surprised that the silver was lying right in the middle of the street, but no one else saw it. How is this possible if silver sparkles so much in the sun? It seemed to Shu that all the people around him were simply blind. They are blinded by their problems and everyday life, but Zhu has an open soul and a bright outlook, so he saw everything that was close. A small family could live for 3 months on the money that Shu found right under his feet. But the strangest thing was that Shu found only gems. Zhu felt scared and sad. He sat down in the middle of the street and hugged his knees. He even wanted to cry, but he held back. Zhu thought about all these findings, and even though it seemed like they were accidental, but it was still very strange. Perhaps it was the system that was watching him, but then why was it hiding? All this time Shu was trying to find a system, but it was not even in his mind. He called for it several times, called for it when he was in prison, but it was all in vain. Zhu was narcissistic and often dreamed of greatness, and this time he managed to imagine that a loser like him, who had never won the lottery, could one day become the emperor of the world. But after a few seconds, Shu returned to Earth from his dreams and realized that he did not have enough life to become emperor. This even made Shu very angry. Zhu returned home. He was still living with his uncle. More precisely, in the house next to his uncle's big mansion. His uncle's butler used to live in this house, but now Shu rents it. His uncle's house was huge, and Shu's rented house looked like a doghouse in comparison. But it was enough for him. He was just about to rest when his aunt came into the room. It is worth saying that since Shu became the only one who earned money in the family, his aunt changed her attitude towards him. She even wished him a good rest. But then, like everyone else, she siphoned money from Shu. It was as if they all turned into demons that fed on Shu's money, and they kept up until Shu gave the money back, and the youngest sister had to buy candy in addition to money. Because when her mouth wasn't busy eating, she was screaming like crazy. Yu went out into the backyard and sat down on a chair. He wanted to rest and unload his thoughts, so he put his hands behind his head and looked up at the sky. Shu was thinking about his luck. If indeed, luck is his gift, then he is incredibly happy about it. But Shu did not know what to do with it. He decided to watch what would happen next. For some reason, Shu remembered how he used to fight with his aunt. She was the kind of person who would yell at him so hard that she would spit. She thought he was a failure and was very jealous of her husband, who spent a lot of time with Shu teaching him martial arts. The aunt did not want to spend their family's money on Shu's training. After all, she had a son whom she was very proud of and wanted to give him the best. And her husband, instead of training with his son, was raising his nephew. Therefore, the aunt was always looking for a reason to kick Shu out of their home and their lives forever. Shu never allowed himself to be insulted. He always knew how to answer his aunt and give important arguments. Shu remembered how he had promised them he would become famous and rich. Perhaps that time had come. It was warm and sunny outside. Shu decided that since he hadn't earned much money yet, he should save some money. After all, money saved is money earned. So he decided to rest for a while and go to his uncle's house for breakfast. Moreover, they always cooked delicious food in their house. And after breakfast, Shu decided to go to Gulan again, to those charming girls, to listen to music, drink tea, and spend money in the right way. When Shu went to his uncle's house, the whole family was already sitting at the table. But everyone looked very depressed, and there was very little food on the table. The table was almost empty. My aunt was not particularly happy that Shu had come to breakfast. Her face showed all the dissatisfaction and anger. She didn't understand why the hell he was here, and Shu didn't understand why no one had offered him breakfast for so long. There were only 6 meat buns, radish sticks, a bowl of tofu, and a plate of porridge on the table. It was a very strange set, because my uncle always had a gorgeous table with delicious food. Xu realized that he wouldn't get enough to eat, but he was very hungry. So Xu decided to cheat. He looked closely at who had the most food on their plate, and sure enough, it was his little sister, Lin Yi. Xu asked her for a delicious bun. He was so kind and friendly to the little girl, but Lin Yi did not want to share. She was very much in charge and never shared her food. On the contrary, everyone had to share with her. Then Xu, as usual, decided to cheat. He took one bun from his plate, and he put it on Lin Yi's plate, as if I were sharing with you. Now you have my bun on your plate, so you have to share it with your brother. Lin Yi was small and stupid, so she did not understand the trick and agreed. But Xu offered to divide the girl's plate equally, and now Xu had the most food on his plate. But Lin Yi was not happy about this. She didn't like to share food, so she slammed her hand on the table. But Xu knew that this little girl could be fooled even more. He tricked her into taking half of her food, and she didn't even notice what happened. Lin Yi was happy that her brother shared with her, and my aunt didn't understand how she could give birth to such a dumbass who couldn't even defend his food. And she was even more angry with Xu, wondering why the hell he was wandering around their house eating them. But suddenly my aunt came back to life, because her son Xinyan came into the room. Xinyan could barely drag his legs. It seemed that he simply forgot to lift them. Xin did die in his soul, and his body just wandered the corridors of the house. His eyes were empty, and his movements were uncertain. But his mother did not notice this. For her, he was the best, the smartest. She had high hopes for him, and was always happy as a child when he came to have breakfast together. The maid also brought Xinyan breakfast, but before eating, his aunt wanted to talk to him. She rarely got to talk to him. He was usually locked in his room writing something. That's why she asked him why he was locked up when he was writing his poems. Everyone starts somewhere and should not be ashamed of their creativity. The aunt was sure that Xinyan was very talented, so she wanted to listen to his poems every day, even if some of them were not very powerful. Without waiting for an answer, the aunt offered her son some meat buns. There were 3 of them on the plate. Xu thought that his brother Xinyan was very good at politics, but that he was a professor of poetry. Xu sat next to him and chewed on his buns. He decided to bother Xinan himself and asked him when he would overcome his current level and move to the 8th level of enlightenment. After all, Xinyan had been studying for so long and could not move to a higher level. Perhaps he was a failure after all, and not as smart and capable a student as his aunt kept telling him. Xinyan is a practicing Confucian. The Yunlu Academy, where he studied, was founded by a disciple of the sage some 1,200 years ago. The Yunlu Academy was a truly holy place where the best scholars came together. The prestige of the Yunlu Academy is associated not only with its founders, it was also the only academy where Confucianism and Taoism were practiced. Therefore, Xinyan was really very cool to be able to study there. Only the best could study there. Xu also dreamed of moving up a level, because when he reached the 9th stage of enlightenment, his memory would improve and he would develop the skill of speed reading. Xinyan was very much affected by this question about the new level. He wanted to throw a bun at Xu, but Xu didn't care about his brother's emotions. He asked what really interested him. So Xu asked what teacher Xinyan said. Doesn't he tell him what to do? Was Xinyan completely hopeless? Xinyan calmed his emotions. He sat calmly with his hand in his lap. He said that everyone has their own path. That's what his teacher taught him. The teacher only demanded that Xinyan memorize the texts of the saints and use them in his life. The first is hard. The second's even harder. It is the same as in the Heiwufu system. For many years, Xinyan perfected his spirit and body to accumulate vital energy. Zhu also wanted to learn this. He knew that in addition to money, the world is also ruled by knowledge, which needs to be constantly improved. But he realized that he still needed to develop his body. Xu thought about it and started discussing all these details out loud. And this made Xinyan frankly angry. Xinyan decided to explain that a true master is one who toughens the spirit and body. That's what his teacher had always taught him, to inspire strength and courage in people's hearts. Xinyan was just trying to create a good method to achieve this. Shu asked how he was doing, but Xinyan did not want to continue this conversation. He thought it was pointless, so he simply turned his back on Shu to show as much disrespect as possible. Jiu was annoyed that his cousin was simply ignoring him, turning his back and remaining silent. Even Shu was not capable of such meanness and disrespect. Xinyan decided to finally talk to his mom. He decided to tell her the latest news from the academy, namely, that the elder of the academy is leaving his post and going to Qingzhou. Xinyan and the other students will send him off with poetry. The aunt was proud of her son. She always knew that he was the best and would reach the highest heights, and to write a poem for an elder was the highest praise. But then Xinyan clenched his hand into a fist and shyly admitted that he had not written any poems for this event. That's why he stayed in his room for a long time and didn't come out, muttering to himself, writing, and erasing. Xinyan tried, made several good attempts, but he never managed to write a perfect poem, and the send-off will take place tomorrow, so he needs to come up with something urgently. Somewhere to find inspiration and the right words. Yu started laughing in his head. Xinyan is not as cool as everyone wants him to be, and his sister even called him a mediocrity, which hurt his brother. The aunt told her daughter to shut up. The aunt emphasized that Xinyan writes great poetry, but is just a little nervous right now. The aunt was proud of her son more than any other child. To her, he was the most gifted, and should have reached the greatest heights. My uncle, on the other hand, never singled anyone out with his attention. He did not like to get involved in all these disputes. He was a real warrior, indifferent to poetry. Therefore, writing a poem that would reach his heart was something strange and unnecessary for him. He calmly drank his tea and advised his son to just write a couple of lines and not to bother. And Zhu decided to remind them that Xinyan really had talent, because in his suicide note, he was very verbose, wrote such important words about his lack of talent, and said goodbye to all his family so beautifully. You remembered every word of the suicide note in detail, and Xinyan could not hold back his aggression because he wanted to forget about it all as soon as possible. He was angry with himself that he could so easily deprive himself of his most precious possessions. He was also angry that his family saw his weakness. Xinyan seems to have realized that if something prevented him from dying then he should live life to the fullest. But you have to make this life as comfortable as possible. And for this, you need to make the right connections. Xinyan decided to return to the discussion of the poems. It was very important to compose the best lines. After all, the poem was written for an elder, the famous Confucius, who himself was very talented in writing poetry. So we had to be on par. Every student at the academy will try to surprise him. Everyone started writing a poem with great responsibility. Everyone would want to impress their teacher. But Xinyi had one more crucial task in mind, besides impressing his teacher with poetry. He also wanted to make new connections. If the elder appreciates Xinyan's work, it will do him good. His life will change, and he will be able to solve any important issues. After all, Confucius is a strong personality and not easy to negotiate with. He will not accept money or gifts. He will only accept what his students have put their hearts into. Zhu chewed on his bun and mentally rejoiced that his brother had finally listened to him and realized that making useful acquaintances was the best idea. Zhu himself lived by the same rule. He only helped those with whom he would be useful as friends in the future. He was not interested in commoners. He reached out to the best, to the upper class, so that he could soon find himself in this higher world. And then Xinyan revealed that perhaps if he had befriended the elders sooner, his family would not have been imprisoned. Xinyan still blamed himself that it was Xu Qian who had freed his family from prison, and the only thing he could do was commit suicide. And he didn't even manage that. He couldn't even die with dignity. So now Xinyan has no right to bury his face in the mud. He has to find the right words and write the best poem that will touch the hearts of others. And most importantly, that will set his teachers on fire. He has to do his best because the other students are also very diligent and may be ahead of Xinyan. My aunt realized the importance of the case, but she could not do anything herself because she had never written poetry. So my aunt did what she did best. She attacked her husband with accusations. She started shouting that Xinyan couldn't write perfect poetry because of his uncle's genes. It's because of his family, which is not very talented, because his uncle's father also wrote a lot of articles that no one wanted. Instead, she comes from a very creative and intelligent family. In general, the fact that her son entered the academy is only her and her family's merit. And her uncle is just a pseudo-intellectual. Lin Yi stopped the quarrel between her uncle and aunt. As usual, she was screaming that she was hungry. The girl's mouth always had to be busy with food, otherwise everyone else would suffer from her cries. But these cries of the little girl even helped the family to reboot a little and switch from the topic of the poems. Hearing his aunt's accusations, Shu shuddered. He immediately rushed to defend his family. Shu grew up without a father, so he always took all insults against him very painfully. He shouted that his family was not untalented. But my aunt said that only the stupid can become warriors, and with handwriting like Shu's, he'll never become anything at all. Yu stopped. He knew it was useless to argue with this woman. She knows her own mind and is not ready to listen to others. But Shu was surprised by Xinyang's behavior. It was the first time he saw his brother take the initiative. Shu had a brilliant idea. His brother's connections plus his connections. If they unite, they will definitely not be lost in this world. Meanwhile, the aunt was thinking about poetry. She really wanted to help her son and write a few lines. Yu interrupted his aunt's thoughts. He decided to loudly declare that he and his family were very talented, and people like Shu Qian are second to none. He can stand up for himself in a fight, holding his sword tightly, and write a poem that will conquer anyone. My uncle was already tired of these showdowns. He just wanted to have a quiet breakfast, but he was not having any of this, so he suggested that Shu just stay out of it. Let Xinyan write his own poetry. Everyone should do the work that suits them. Zhu was silent for a few seconds, and then he said something that no one expected. He began to compose an incredible poem on the fly. The words poured out like a river and were so harmoniously combined with each other. 1,000 fiery skies in the soft light of the snow-white sun. Everyone's eyes went to their foreheads from what they heard. Every word of the poem was beautiful. Everyone was looking forward to what would happen next. What words would complement this poem and, most importantly, how it would end. Zhu did not stop. The basis of his talent was measuredness and calmness. He would calmly pour the tea and continue to speak, word after word, rhyme with rhyme. Xinyang listened to the poem and was mesmerized. It was as if he was immersed in a parallel world. In his imagination, every word turned into reality. The pictures were very clear and touched his heart. His eyes seemed to reflect everything that Shu had said. His eyes shone with joy and bliss. It was as if the poem was being recited not by his cousin Shu Qian, with whom Xinyan had always had conflict, but by an angel, for the voice and the words were gifted with God's grace. Birds and snow and a magical princess riding a horse. Everything came to life in Xinyan's imagination. It was as if he was in that beautiful world, in another reality. It seemed that this poem was written specifically for him, not for the teacher, but Xinyan realized that everyone feels the same way now. This is how the magic of poetry works, the magic of words that touches everyone. While Shu was rhyming, he poured a whole cup of tea. He did it as confidently and calmly as the words in the poem sounded. Harmony reigned around him. Without being distracted by anything, Shu continued to compose the lines. "Do not be afraid, traveler, go ahead, for you will not meet an enemy on the road." Shu said the last word and held out a cup of tea to Xinyan. Xinyan was mesmerized. He savored every word and seemed to have plunged into another dimension, forgetting about everything winter, about the fact that he was now sitting at the table having breakfast. Xinyan listened so attentively that he even dropped the bun from his hand. The bun fell, but no one even noticed. Everyone was enveloped in the pleasant aroma of the poem. Jinyan repeated the last lines of the poem he had just composed and loudly declared that it was a masterpiece. He had never heard anything better in his life. After breakfast, Shu decided to practice his fighting skills. His uncle also wanted to remember his youth. They had a sword duel. Shu was very focused and fought with great precision. Although my uncle was old, he was also a very skilled warrior. He effectively deflected all the blows. The blades of his swords clanged over and over again. Zhu was very maneuverable. He attacked from different sides. He tried to do it in such a way that my uncle would not even notice which side he would attack from next. But my uncle always repelled all his attacks accurately. And the heart punch was deflected by my uncle in such a way that Shu was thrown back, and barely managed to stay on his feet and landed on his hand. His uncle praised Shu for his good movement. Zhu was very focused on the fight. His gaze was concentrated, his movements precise and deliberate, but most importantly, his thoughts were clear. Shu wanted to win, so he only joked about his uncle's praise so that he wouldn't exaggerate. The fight was successful. They were both very tired and sat down to rest at a table near a tree. The uncle was very pleased with his nephew's martial training. He said that he could easily reach the 8th level of Qi cultivation. He just needed to try a little harder. The uncle advised Shu to start training, and to find teachers with level 7 to open the heavenly gate. It was his uncle's long-held dream to reach level 8. He remembered how long it had taken him to get there. He had participated in the battle of mountains and seas, and he did it only so that his teacher could open the heavenly gate, and his uncle could reach level 8. This war took so long. Uncle returned home when his eldest son Xinyan was 2 years old. Shu also wanted to move to a new level, but he didn't know how to do it. After all, it was peacetime. There is simply no place to perform feats. How else could he get to the next level? Shu asked his uncle if he knew of any way out, but his uncle did not want Shu to fight and die in a battle somewhere. He wanted his nephew to get married as soon as possible, and finally have children. Shu laughed. He definitely didn't want kids yet. He had enough of that shit in his past life. Ziya told his uncle that he had another way to achieve fame, to make a lot of money. But if Shu decides to move to the next level, there is a special procedure for that. My uncle pulled out a document and read out how everything should go. The emperor keeps all martial artists under his personal control. Masters are not allowed to open the heavenly gates. The emperor must be personally informed of the intention to open the gate. But now corruption is rampant in Dafan. The emperor's influence has weakened greatly. Therefore, many level 8 masters offer their services on the black market. Meanwhile, Shu had already racked his brains for ways to make a lot of money. But nothing came to mind. Because when Shu thought about business, other desires, sexual desires, immediately arose in his mind. He finally wanted to meet a woman and lose his virginity. While the men were sitting at the table discussing important matters, an aunt and her daughters approached them unnoticed. The aunt suggested that the uncle go for a walk. The younger daughter was very happy that her father would go with them. But the older one was against such company. She was too old to go out with her parents. But the uncle had other plans. He wanted to talk and drink with his colleagues. So he invited Zhu to keep the girls company. Her uncle's eldest daughter was not too happy about this company. She wanted to go for a walk with her older brother. But it was still better than going out with her dad. So she agreed. Shu didn't have any special plans either, so he kept the girls company. Suddenly everyone wondered where Xinyan had gone. Jinyang and the other students were preparing for the send-off. The whole procession was to take place in the outskirts of Dafan. The students were worried about how the farewell ceremony would go. But most of all, they were worried about their poem. One of the students asked Xinyan if he had a poem ready for Mr. Jian's send-off. Xinyan remembered what a brilliant poem Shu had written, but he had only come up with half of the poem, and he hadn't told the other half. Xinyan begged Shu to tell him the other half, but Shu just ran away from him. Of course, Xinyi did not want to tell his friends about all these details. Tu briefly said that he only had half of the poem, but that he would come up with the rest. One of the students, Yun, was unnerved by Xinyan's self-confidence. They wanted everything to go off at the highest level, and no one to fail the whole idea. Moreover, everyone wanted to make the right connections. Everyone else also agreed that they should all be 100% ready, and have their poems ready, not just half of them. The students knew that getting to the top required connections. Nepotism was rampant in the government. The only way to succeed was through good connections. The palace was also preparing for the send-off. There were 3 people sitting at the table. They were talking about playing chess and drinking tea. Grandmaster Lim Ubai turned to the respected Yang, who was the best chess player. But 5 years ago, he lost 3 games in a row. Then he threw away the board and never returned to the game. The strategist Zhang Shen said that Mr. Yang was wrong. Such a clever chess player is lost because of ambition. Yang was very famous and intelligent. His work, 6 treatises on the art of war, is still required reading for soldiers and generals. That's why they were very sad that Yang Gong was leaving the academy. Yang Gong recognized that he was no longer an official. For 14 years he had been an outstanding scholar, but he left his post and went to Yunnan Academy to teach. And now, 22 years later, he goes to Qinzhou. All 3 of us sat drinking tea and thinking about what an injustice it was that the academy officials did not allow Yulia to be revived. No one understands the potential of Yulia. You can't just screw up an educational institution like this because of some stupid ambitions of the bosses. It was about 2 academies that have long been unable to share a place in the sun. There has long been a very intense struggle between the Yulnu Academy and the State Academy. The Yulnu Academy was founded by a student of the great Confucius and was considered the best educational institution. But 200 years ago, due to a dispute with the emperor, the Yulnu Academy was in a bad state. And at that time, one of Yulnu's teachers took advantage of the situation and created his own school. He bought the emperor's attention using a new concept. Therefore, with the support of the emperor, a state academy was established which began training officials. Since then, the state academy has replaced the Yulnuts as the main educational institution. The fame of the Yulnuts Academy began to fade, although the best teachers still taught there. Therefore, someone had to redress this injustice and restore its former glory. 200 years later, Yang Gong decided to restore the previous glory of the Yulna Academy. To do this, they had to educate as many talented people as possible within the walls of the academy. The recipe was simple. The talented students would be scattered around the world, but they would all be proud of their origins and their education. Each of them will tell how skillfully and competently they were educated at Yulnu. The name of this academy will always be heard, and its glory will return. All 3 teachers addressed their students. They asked if the students had prepared any poems and if there was anyone who wanted to read their poem. After all, a good poem could have made Yulia famous. One good line could change history, but not everyone could write this line, which would be woven into the poem, but only a select few. Yang Gong noted that the best reader would receive a jasper pendant. This was the best incentive for the students. When the students heard this, they were stunned. Everyone wanted to receive such a gift, and they all began to hold out their hands with a desire to recite their poem. Zhu Tuiji, a student, wanted to start. He bowed low to show his respect and was ready to begin. So each of the students read their poem one by one. Several hours passed, but not a single poem was worthy. The 3 teachers were tired of listening and did not even hope that anyone could surprise them. The poems were mundane and uninteresting. They had no blessed meaning. They were just words put together. Instead, at the academy, Yulia was taught to write in such a way that every word pierced and touched the soul, so that the poem would be relevant years later. Somewhere in their hearts, the 3 teachers blamed themselves for not providing enough knowledge and for not being able to compose a brilliant poem. And it was all because of the State Academy. Because since the State Academy rewrote the sacred texts, the students have been reading only classical literature. But unfortunately, this did not give them any spiritual development. Only a spiritually enriched person, according to the teachers, could have an impact on the masses. He could control humanity through the power of words, and so Confucianism began to decline. Previously, talents were born in the womb and only increased their knowledge every year. Now it was happening less and less. There were fewer and fewer gifted students in the academy, and it was noticeable to the naked eye. The teachers listened to the poems and realized that each one was worse than the last. Yang Gong was very disappointed. He wanted to leave the academy with the hope of a bright future, with the hope that the academy would regain its greatness and glory. But today's farewell day was very disappointing for him. None of the students were worthy. No one could even write a decent poem, but the flicker of hope was still burning. So Yang Gong decided to ask if there was anyone else who wanted to read his poem. Finally, Xinyan dared to read his poem. He gathered his will in a fist for a long time, scrolling through each word in his head so as not to stutter while reading. And now the time had come. It was time to show his courage and talent. The other students thought he was an upstart and did not understand where he was going with only half of the poem. Teacher Xinyan tried to stop him, but it was too late. Jinyi came to the center, bowed low, and said that he had written a poem for Jijian. Then Xinyan's teacher decided to praise him a bit and basically said that his student was very talented in his studies, and he quietly added that he was absolutely talentless in poetry. But Xinyan still had a different opinion. He closed his eyes and was ready to recite. From the first word, Xinyan shocked everyone. Everyone listened to him with their mouths open. One of the scientists noted that even the first two phrases are already extraordinary. I wonder what will happen next. Yang Gong listened attentively and realized that it was thanks to people like Xinya that the glory of the Yulnu Academy could be revived. With such students, Yulnu had a great future, and Jinyi continued to recite word after word, amplifying each phrase with active hand gestures. He pronounced the last sentence very clearly and distinctly. Xinyan was proud that his performance was so successful. Yang Hong was also very impressed. He said it was a masterpiece. All the students were of the same opinion. Everyone was waiting for the sequel and demanded that Xinyan continue her speech. Three powerful teachers who organized this competition for the best recitation of the poem were especially looking forward to the sequel. But Xinyan seemed to have taken water in his mouth. He was just silent, and then he said that he had prepared only half of the poem. The students didn't understand how he could stop halfway through. What kind of a person is he to keep his teachers waiting? But even this half impressed Yang Gong, and he said it was okay that Xinyi had only prepared part of the poem. Even with this half of the poem, Yang Gong provoked a great future for Xinyang. He knew that if such a wonderful poem spreads around the world, it will interest and inspire many people. The poem would become a light in the tunnel. Words will be guides. Such poems appear once in a million but remain in memory for many generations. Yang Gong asked what the title of Xinyang's poem was, but Xinyang replied that he hadn't thought of a name yet. Although Xinyang knew that his cousin had not actually told him the name, even though Xinyang had asked him to do so. But the cunning cousin refused. He loved it when someone begged him and humiliated him. Then Shu felt his greatness, but Xinyang did not want to be humiliated, so he was left without a title for the poem. He couldn't come up with a title on his own either. Then Yang Gong said that if this poem was in his honor, he would name it after him. Xinyan was glad that someone would do the important work for him again. Yang Gong thought for a long time. He titled the poem Dedicated to Yang Gong in the Sheep Pavilion. When a student writes a poem to a teacher, he can use only his pseudonym or middle name in the title. Only those close to him or equal in status can use a middle name. Therefore, it was very honorable that Yang Gong named the poem after himself. The other teachers realized Yang Gong's cunning plan. He just wanted to be famous for such a powerful poem. Yang Gong did not even hide it. He really wanted fame. But suddenly Xinyan decided to say something else. He squared his shoulders and basically said that he did not actually write this poem. A lump stood in the middle of his throat. It was hard for Xinyan to speak, but he was too honest not to admit the truth. The teachers were shocked. No one understood, even Xinyan admitted it, and the niche students were trying to guess who this talent was, and whether he was studying at their academy. Xinyan emphasized that the poem was written by his brother. The students were shocked. Some of them didn't even know that he had a brother, and that he was such a talented poet. Suddenly Xinyan came to his senses. He did not understand why he had to say anything about his brother. He could have just kept quiet and then he would have gotten all the glory. But because of his father's bad influence, he was always honest and fair, unlike his cousin who was cunning and self-serving. But despite this, he was very talented. Sometimes Jinyan envied his brother for not being able to outwit everyone like Shu, because it could have saved his life. Instead, Jinyan is fighting for his brother's lucky ticket to life. Jinyan realized that if he admitted that his brother was a warrior, the other students would die of shame. After all, how could a warrior write such brilliant poetry, and they, the students of Yulnu, could not? I had to embellish the picture a bit and describe my brother as an intelligent and noble person, a man of honor and word. So Sinai decided to lie a little. He said that his brother was practicing poetry at home, and he was studying at a state academy. Everyone was shocked to hear this. They could not even say a word, but everyone really wanted to meet such a talented person. Jinyan continued that his brother is indifferent to the whole world. He is not interested in fame or success. He just plunged headlong into the classics. Of course, Sinyan knew that this was not true, that his brother was a bum who only knew how to spend money. But in the opinion of the students of the academy, such a dissolute person could not write such fantastic poetry. Therefore, it was impossible to destroy the image of a genius in the eyes of everyone present. The students had not yet met Brother Sinyan, but they already admired him incredibly. They thought that Brother Sinyan was like a god. He is wise and just. He has a firm word that everyone in the family listens to. The performance was over. Yanggong went to Qinzhou. The jasper pendant, of course, went to Xinyan. He was incredibly happy to receive such a gift. He was just glowing with happiness. He held the pendant in his hands as tightly as if it were a bag of gold, but in fact the pendant meant even more to Xinyan than gold. It was part of his recognition, his lucky ticket to the future. Xinyan had received another ticket to life, and he did not want to miss it. Yanggong got into his carriage and drove away. He waved goodbye to his students. He told his colleagues that such a talent cannot wither away, and asked the teachers to find him. But since Yanggong was no longer a scholar, the other teachers no longer needed his advice. They said goodbye politely and knew what to do. The teachers dreamed of finding Brother Xinyan themselves. All they had to do was ask him for more information. But Xinyi himself dreamed of becoming a teacher and taking on his first student. Xinyi thought about his brother. Maybe he would be a good student. Maybe he would be as good at studying as he was at writing poetry. Scientists Lim Wubai and Zhang Shen rushed to find Xinyan. Each wanted to meet his brother. They were so friendly and loving that Xinyi was very surprised. He had never seen his teachers so attentive and smiling. But behind this kindness, they had their own agenda. Zhang Shen was Xinyan's personal mentor. He had never singled Xinyan out in any way, nor praised him in front of others. But suddenly he became very kind and attentive. Jianshen said that he wanted Xinyan and his brother to become his disciples. Lim Wubai was very angry. He also wanted to make such an offer to Xinyan. But his colleague beat him to it. He dreamed that one day such an incredible poem would be written about him, and he would call it by his name, Yan Shen. The poem will be passed down from generation to generation, and the salwa about Yan Shen will live forever. This idea sounded wonderful to the teacher. All that was left was to find a talented student who would enlarge his teacher's name in the poem forever. But Lim Wubai was quick to put down Zhang Shen's ambitions. He caught him by the shoulder and reminded him that he was a martial arts teacher. To become a worthy scholar, he still had to study and read the ancient scriptures himself, to know the rules and regulations. In short, Zhang Shen still has a lot of work to do and will not have time to train another student. Zhang Sheng was very disappointed that he would not be able to take such an intelligent student under his tutelage. But Zhang Shen did not want such a smart student to go to someone else, so he told Lim that he was a failure too. The two teachers were arguing loudly and shouting at each other. Xinyan did not know how to behave in this situation, and whether anyone should introduce his brother to anyone at all. He himself had ambitions to become a great scholar and teacher. Shu could have helped him in this if he had become his student. But such a young talent as Xinyan would not be allowed to develop by other older teachers. They wanted recognition and were ready to gnaw each other's throats for their status and honors. Two teachers almost got into a fight to prove who was cooler. One was throwing mud at the other. They were pushing and shouting loudly. Meanwhile, Shu Qian and his family were walking through the streets of the city. It was the main street with many shops. It was always crowded. It was the first time he had ever been out with his family like that. Previously, their relationship had been very cold and unfriendly. Zhu usually only quarreled with his aunt, and he just didn't pay attention to his sisters. He wasn't interested in their company. Zhu liked to be alone with himself and in the company of other people. But relatives were never a priority for him. Only his uncle was more annoying, but he did not neglect this attention. He knew that his uncle was always busy. But after his release from prison, everything changed. The sisters also noticed that their cousin had changed a lot. He has become attentive and responsive. He has become friendly and now always greets them and always buys candy for his younger sister. Maybe he does this so that she doesn't scream that she's hungry again, but it was still very nice of him. But the most important thing that all the relatives noted was that Shu Qian was not as indifferent as he used to be. On the contrary, he became very friendly and helpful. My older sister was always embarrassed when Shu looked at her in a special way. She was not used to the attention of men. And even when her brother looked at her in a different way, she was very embarrassed. But Shu Qian did not mean to shame his sister in any way. He just had another brilliant idea on how to make a lot of money. He figured he could improve the clothes of this era. Shu presented himself as a cool designer who understands the quality of fabrics. He knew how to make patterns and sew what he considered to be chic clothes. Shu knew that clothes should be made for women because they are the biggest connoisseurs of beauty. But these clothes had to be radically different from the way women and girls dress now. So Zhu imagined how these new clothes would look on his sister. She could be his first model. Shu mentally undressed his sister. He made her clothes very revealing and sexy. A short skirt, a top, and stockings, so that every curve of the body was visible, so that men would fall at their feet when such a gorgeous girl walked in front of them. But the highlight of the image is the details. Shu decided to add ears to the head, like a cat. And then Shu Qian sank to the ground. He realized that this was vulgar. He would be killed by his own uncle for wearing such clothes.